All right, Mutt. You coming up on your own, or do we have to drag you up here? Dantes smirked, rolling his shoulders. No need for that. I was made for the stage. He stepped forward, his escort dispersing now that it seemed the elves intended to honor their part of the bargain. As he moved, he caught sight of Tell, grinding his teeth in frustration, while Pinion watched with an impish grin. If luck was on his side, perhaps he'd get the chance to kill him, too. Dantes climbed onto the stage, but Riavare leapt up beside him, moving with effortless grace, clearly relishing the opportunity to loom over him. The elf was nearly a foot taller, his lean muscles and tattooed skin a sharp contrast to Dantes' below-average height, many-pocketed jacket, and underweight frame. As Dantes glanced into the crowd, he spotted familiar faces. Iron in the Mine, leader of the Stonedust clan, lifted his drink in a mocking toast, a cruel smile on his lips. A half-dozen people huddled around a gnome running a gambling stand, exchanging bets, likely on how long he'd last before getting skewered. The elves in attendance made sure to throw in a handful of racial slurs, just for good measure. Toward the back, Sin stood disguised as an Orcish onlooker. He was surprised she wasn't working the crowd, but when she shot him a brief wink, he had his answer. She knows. Maybe not the full plan, but she knows I'm up to something. The rest of the audience was just a mix of opportunists, gamblers, and merchants. They weren't here for him, not really. They were here for the spectacle. The pit could be a dull place, after all. Riavare smirked, resting his hand on the hilt of his rapier, its blade embedded in the wooden stage. So, dog, he drawled, gripping the weapon and pulling it free in a single smooth motion. Do you want to lie down and let me drive this into your heart? Or will you stand and risk flinching when I have to stab you a second time? Dantes met his gaze without hesitation. I'll stand. Riavare's smirk widened as he flourished the blade dramatically, turning to the crowd. The mutt thinks he's brave. His toadies laughed on cue. Let's see if that's still the case when the blade enters his ribs. Dantes ignored him. Instead, he made minute adjustments, shifting the rats beneath the stage into place. He used Jacopo's eyes, the rat perched on a nearby rooftop, to confirm where everyone was standing. Then, he moved to the opposite end of the stage, spreading his arms wide. I'm going to give you one last chance, he called out, his voice carrying over the crowd, silencing their jeers. Riavare lifted his rapier, aligning the point directly with Dantes' heart. Lost your mind to fear already? He sneered. One last chance for what? Dantes grinned. To surrender. Riavare scoffed. Here, I thought you might have half a brain. I'm afraid I'll have to decline, Mutt. Dantes exhaled. Suit yourself. Bleed. Beneath the stage and throughout the gathered elves, the rats nicked themselves, smearing their blood across hidden mirror shards before scurrying away. The sudden movement startled a few onlookers, causing muttered curses. Dantes shrugged. Well, let no one say I didn't give you a chance. You gray-skinned fool, Riavare sneered, lunging forward, his blade cutting straight toward Dantes' chest. Then the stage exploded. The force of the blast engulfed Riavare's legs, sending him flying. At the same time, 8 simultaneous detonations erupted in the heart of the Elven King's ranks. The results were instantaneous and brutal. The nearest elves were torn apart, their limbs and viscera spraying across the battlefield. Those not killed outright were thrown backward, screaming as jagged bone shrapnel from their dead comrades ripped into their flesh. The undermarket erupted into chaos. Panic took hold. Some froze in sheer horror, unable to process what had just happened. Others saw opportunity, looting abandoned stalls and rifling through the bodies of the dead without hesitation. Dantes had been launched from a stage, but had braced for impact, landing in a booth selling sharpened rocks. He pushed himself up, taking stock of the situation. His fong of favor was down to half, meaning the rats he had sent deep into Elfland King territory had also completed their mission. If everything went as planned, those additional explosions would have eliminated even more of their leadership, on top of severing their connection to the outside world. A silver flash caught his eye. A rapier shot toward him. Dantes threw himself aside, just in time. The blade sliced through the air where he'd been a moment before. The wielder? Riavare. Both of his legs were charred ruins, and a piece of stage jutted from his side, but he was still alive. His eyes burned with hatred as he advanced. "You degenerate mixed piece of shit." He lunged again. Dantes dodged, barely avoiding the rapid strikes. Had Riavare not been wounded, I'd be dead already. "You don't know how I did this, huh?" Dantes taunted, backing toward a nearby alley. "Too stupid to figure it out?" He grabbed a broken chunk of wood from the stage, deflecting the next stab just in time. "No comments about my skull shape, making it impossible for me to out-weak you." He dove into the alley, drawing his shiv from his boot. Riavare scoffed, flicking the wood from his rapier. "Even a rat can possess a low cunning." He stalked forward. "That doesn't make it greater than the cat that hunts it." "Attack!" 3 dozen rats surged from the shadows, swarming up Riavare's legs. The elf screamed, frantically trying to claw them off as they bit and tore into his flesh. He threw himself against a wall, crushing some, but there were too many. Dantes didn't wait for the favor to run out. He lunged, his shiv plunging deep into Riavare's chest. The elf gasped. He gave Dantes one last hate-filled glare before the life faded from his eyes. His body slumped. Dantes stumbled back, panting. Even half-exploded, even swarmed by rats, Riavare had almost killed him. Had this been a fair fight, he never would have stood a chance. But fair fights weren't his forte. Dantes looked down at the rats still feasting. "You guys can leave if you want. Or, snack for a minute while I catch my breath." A mottled gray rat with dagger-like fangs looked up at him, blood dripping from its mouth. "The eyeballs are the best part." Dantes nodded. "Uh-huh. Thanks for sharing." Once he'd recovered, he looted the body, stripping it of its sheath, belt, and miraculously intact boots. He pocketed a small glass vial of dust and a handful of gold coins. Then he grabbed Riavare's corpse by the golden strands of hair and dragged it into the center of the Undermarket. Silence spread. The looters stopped. The fighting ceased. Not a single full-blooded elf remained in sight. They had either died or run. When Dantes was sure he had everyone's attention, he lifted Riavare's lifeless body into the air. Then he raised the rapier and slowly turned in a circle, pointing the blade at everyone. "Let this be a lesson. A beat of silence. Don't fuck with me." Then he dropped the corpse and walked away. The Undermarket parted for him. Dantes made his way back to his cave, his mind weaving plans upon plans, each stacking atop the last in the wake of his victory. The euphoria coursing through him was intoxicating. The immediate threat was gone, and now he had more tools at his disposal than ever before. For the first time in years, survival wasn't just about scraping by in the shadows. He could build. He could escape. It had been done before. Tristan 2 lives. The Major removed his slave collar by killing himself, only to be revived and freed. The Green Blight, an orc who earned his release by fighting through an arena gauntlet no one before or after had survived. Gideon Gallant, the gnome who vanished into the ruins and emerged outside the pit's walls, never to be seen again. Those were the legends, the ones people whispered about in dark corners. But between those legends, Dantes knew there had to be dozens more. People who bribed the right guards, who had allies on the surface, who found cracks in the system that no one ever noticed. Some might have even been desperate enough to climb their way out of the maw itself, slipping past the guards under cover of night. It was those mundane methods that interested him most. He wasn't a fighter, at least not one good enough to take on the arena. He wasn't insane enough to risk the deep ruins, where things worse than elves lurked in the dark. And besides, after those past escapes, they'd sealed the tunnels leading to the surface. No, he needed a new way out. But first, he needed resources. The blow he'd dealt to the Elfland kings gave him a reputation, one he could trade on, but also one he'd need to repair. The Consortium would be furious about the chaos he'd unleashed in the Undermarket. That was his first step, mending that relationship. There was no way forward without at least their indifference. More importantly, if anyone knew other methods of escape, it would be them. The Blooming Garden. Dantes squeezed through the narrow entrance to his cave, adjusting his new rapier to fit through. Jacopo leapt from his jacket, scurrying toward his usual spot on the ground, curling up for a nap. Dantes, however, kept moving, pacing, thinking, planning. He traced a crack in the stone with his middle finger as he walked back and forth, his mind running through possibilities. He was bruised, battered, exhausted, but for the first time in 5 years, his soul was alight. Eventually, he forced himself outside, toward his orchard. He hadn't been gone long, but the plants had grown wildly in his absence. The garden had spread beyond where he had first planted the seeds, vines creeping outward, crimson leaves unfurling from sprouting bushes. It was working. He reached out with his senses brushing against the life within. They were thriving, but they were hungry. They wanted more blood. Dantes obliged them, pressing a scabbed wound from Rievare's rapier until drops of blood fell onto the roots of each plant. The garden shuddered with satisfaction. Once he had fed the earth, he sat on a raised stone and checked his rat mark. The gold on the fong was almost gone. Not unexpected. The favor he had burned through during the battle had pushed him to his limits. Without the rats, Rievare would have killed him. Now, he needed to rebuild that favor. The fruit from his garden was meant for another plan, but he could afford to set aside a tenth for the rats. That would help in the long run, but he needed a faster way to build favor. If he were in Rendhold, it would be easy. The larger gangs always had bodies they needed to get rid of. Bodies made for good rat food, a plan for later. But for now, he had other work to do. Nightfall and whispers. Back in his cave, he watered the plants growing inside, soft moss slowly spreading across the floor. He fed the fungus in the corner. The simple task calmed him. Or maybe it was the adrenaline wearing off. Or the blood loss. Either way, his exhaustion finally caught up with him. Yawning, he wiped a tear from the corner of his eye and set out canvas sacks for the morning. He placed his rapier beside his makeshift bed and collapsed onto the stone. Sleep came instantly. He expected a deep, empty sleep. He was wrong. The table of fate. Dantes floated. A large, familiar table stretched before him. At its center sat a scale. On one side sat the man in the midnight blue cloak. On the other, the woman in green, her predator's smile sharp as a knife. They spoke, their voices muffled, their words just beyond his grasp. The scene had changed since last time. The woman in green was no longer alone. A large gray rat curled beside her, its eyes gleaming as she scratched behind its ears. The scale at the table center now held far more coins than before, and between them, 3 coins sat on the table, both the green woman and the blue man gesturing toward them. They reached forward, each taking a coin for themselves. Then, they both reached for the third. Their hands met. Dantes woke up. A new day, a new deal. Pain greeted him immediately. His body ached. His head pounded. He dragged himself toward his water pitcher, drinking half of it in one go. Only then did he realize how hungry he was. With a grunt, he pried his rock aside and dug into his food store, finishing off the last of his dried meat and softened crackers. Across the cave, Jacopo stirred. Dantes tossed him a bit of food, watching as the rat snatched it from the air. Ready for it before I even threw it. He smirked. Psychic now, are we? Jacopo only chomped down on his meal, unbothered. Once the rat had finished eating, Dantes gathered the sacks he'd set aside the night before, buckled his new rapier to his waist, and stepped outside. The garden had flourished overnight. The trees stretched higher, the crimson-leafed vines sprawled further, and fresh fruit ripened on the branches. They had grown well, a reward for his blood. He reached out with his senses and felt the rats lurking in the tunnels nearby. "Come eat all you like," he whispered. "Just leave the sacks alone." Not 5 seconds later, dozens of rats poured into the garden, feasting on the fruit. His rat mark pulsed, the first glimmers of gold returning to the fawn. Satisfied, he slung one sack over his shoulder, plucked a single apple, and bit into it as he walked. He had a business deal to make. It had been a while since he'd seen Mez. And now,
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Dantes moved quickly and comfortably through the outskirts, shifting through narrow passageways and avoiding sealed passages and dead ends. This was a more frequently tread path for him, one that he didn't need much thought to move through. It had the added benefit of being rarely traveled by anyone except for him. The kobolds would approach from a different direction, and while had occasionally seen a random orc or drunken dwarf with mez, none of them would have approached from collared territory and taken his path. This meant he could relax, at least as much as was possible for him. The trek loosened his muscles, and he started finding some relief from his soreness. He began to extend his perception around himself, sensing rats, mosses, mushrooms, roaches, and all sorts of other critters surviving on the fringes of the pit. Before, Head often thought of the pit as devoid of life and empty of anything of value, but he had no such misconceptions now. "What are we doing?" asked Jacopo from one of Dantes' jacket pockets. "Heading to see a contact of mine. To feed? The fruit would go much further with me and other rats." "No, the fruit is for him to use to make booze." "Booze." Dantes scratched his chin. "You know, in the undermarket, the buildings with a strong smell that people gather at?" Jacopo was silent for a moment, and Dantes could feel him searching both of their thoughts. He attempted to send an image of one of the bars to Jacopo's mind. "Yes, I know this place. You ever drink from one of the cups that fell on the ground? Sip from a puddle near it?" Jacopo nodded, an expression Dantes could feel but not see as he ducked under a partially collapsed doorway. "Yes." It caused my vision to blur, and I proceeded to the nearest female for mating. Dantes inclined his head. "Yes, booze definitely has that effect on some. You wish to have it made for yourself?" Dantes shook his head. "Some of it. Maybe, though I need to stay sharp for now." "No, I needed to trade." "For what?" "Dust, weed, favor, coin if they have it. Why not simply take those things?" "They'll be doing that too, but it helps to have a semi-legitimate trade going as well. Trading the booze will give me more opportunities to steal, kill, bribe, manipulate, and control." Jacopo scratched himself behind the ears. "You and your people are very complicated. Only when we aren't desperate. The more we have, the more complicated we make things to have more, until we have layer upon layer of complication. When I was first thrown into the pit, things were much simpler. Now, they're becoming complicated for me again. And if others come to take what you have the simple way, then I'd have layers of complications to protect me. And if they don't," he shrugged, "then things get simple again." Jacopo scurried from one pocket to another across Dante's back. "I'd like some of this booze when you receive it. Keeping things simple, at least until I begin running on two legs. Then I may add complications." Dantes chuckled. "Fair enough. They'll make sure to set some aside for you." They made their way through a few more tunnels when Dantes slowed down. Had reached the edges of where Mez kept his traps. Luckily, Mez was the only kobold who never updated or moved them. He made them more out of cultural habit than because he wanted to. His energies had always been focused elsewhere. The story has been taken without consent. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. Dantes made his way around the falling rock trap, the skitterling pit where the skitterlings had long since begun resorting to cannibalism due to lack of food, and ducked under the already triggered, but not reset, spear trap that had pinned a cobweb-riddled skeleton stuck to a wall. Once through that, he came into a fairly large chamber that reeked like the worst bars at the Rendhold docks. The scent brought back memories of his father that made him grimace, but he shifted his expression when Mez came into view so that he could put on a friendly smile instead. Mez was leaned over a large metal cauldron, which he was stirring intently, the entirety of his focus on the work in front of him. Dantes had no idea where Head found the cauldron, or most of his other equipment for that matter. It was a hodgepodge of somehow unbroken glass, metal buckets, leaky wooden barrels, and clay pots. All of it was filled with some kind of liquid, or soon-to-be liquid, that was fermenting, and if one smelled any of them too closely, their nose hairs would burn away. It all reminded Dantes of an alchemist shop Head robbed with his gang in their early days. They'd made out with 30 pieces of silver, a bag of unlabeled potions that shattered before they made their escape, and a strange rash from touching ingredients that had been left out. It had been a failure, but the silver kept them pleasantly drunk and high for a few weeks at least. Dantes pondered all of this while waiting for Mez to break his concentration. It was never a good idea to disturb a kobold that was intently focused on what they were doing. Usually it was because they could accidentally trigger whatever deadly trap they were working on, but in this case, it just seemed rude. Mez finished another half-stir motion and reached a bare claw into the liquid, putting it into his mouth to taste the concoction he was working on. He nodded twice, seemingly satisfied, and then his head and tail twisted as his tongue tasted the air. Mez was a deep red in color, with random purple scales and pockets across his hide. He wore alcohol-stained rags and was missing several teeth on the right side of his face from the fight that had landed him in the pit. From what Dantes had gathered, the orc had been fighting had come out of the brawl without the use of his legs, which seemed a more than fair trade. Tez, welcome. I had thought you would be dead by now. Ah, you heard about the problem with the Elfland Kings? No, I just thought you'd be dead in general. What did you do with the Elfland Kings? Killed their leadership and a big chunk of their people. Destroyed their magic mirrors that let them smuggle things into the pit. How well, fuck 'em. Last time I was in the undermarket, one of them called me a short-scaled fuckwit with a skull shape that indicates incest earlier in my family tree. Yeah, they can be pretty elaborate with their insults. I mean, sure, my parents were cousins, so it's partially true, but the rest of it was uncalled for. Definitely taking things too far, said Dantes, nodding and resisting a chuckle that had begun bubbling up. How have you been? Good. Got some business last week from some of those mage folk with the pretty necklaces. May have figured out a way to make the black moss brew taste less like you're going to die. The mage folk, did they mention they were sent by me? Mez flicked his tongue and sighed. They did. The one with the oddly pretty hair was very insistent. You told him I gave good rates. Did you? Yes, I only charged them double. Dantes nodded. That was still quite a bit cheaper than what they'd be paying in the undermarket, where the markup was much higher. He gave a light cough and held out his hand. Mez went over to a far corner of his cave and rifled through a few broken pieces of porcelain under which Dantes knew he had hidden a small cache of goods. He came back to Dantes with a small pouch of dust and a bag of dried food. Seems light. At it novel been at. You could leave a hand lighter if you're not happy with it, responded Mez, baring his teeth. Dantes held up his hand. I trust you, just wondering if the mages got the better of you in the deal is all. The lie was reflexive and easy. Mez shrugged. Not like I get many customers. I mostly just charge what I need to in order to keep working anyway. So what are you here for? Just to get your cut? Or want to get a little something for yourself to make the days pass by quicker? I could use a fresh palate to sample some of the new stuff with me. I actually came here to do a different kind of business with you. Dantes placed the sack on the ground between them and opened it enough to show Mez what was inside. His eyes widened. Fruit? Fresh fruit. Where do you get this? Don't worry about the source. This much he squinted. What do you want for it? I want whatever you produce with it. I can get you even more than this every single week. Dantes had a feeling he could manage a full sack a day, but it was better to underpromise and overdeliver in his experience. What would you even do with it? Drink yourself to death? Trade it? I want to make a deal with the small folk consortium with most of it. The rest I was thinking ID sling on the side. Cut you in on the profits, of course. 50-50? Dantes shook his head. You can have 15, or I can throw this sack and the rest of it in the caves for the rats. You start worshipping the god of greed all of a sudden, you bastard. 15 is because I like you. If I didn't, it would be 10. Mez looked at the sack of fruit, the gears turning behind his eyes as he considered all of the new equipment he could buy and the amount he could produce. Did I ever tell you that you're the most handsome midtown mutt I've ever seen? Dantes smiled. All right, 20 it is. He held out his hand, and Mez clasped it. With the deal made, Dantes left Mez to his brewing and headed back to his cave. The trek was easy, particularly without the weight of the sack head carried on the way there. Once he was back in his cave, he checked his rat mark and saw that one fong mark was full again, lit gold on his skin. The rats had clearly enjoyed the meal Head offered them, and their god had granted his favor for it. Head back into the garden shortly to feed the plants his blood that they so desired, but he had other plans first. It was going to take time for Mez to brew the first batch, and he wouldn't want to approach the consortium without something in hand. They tended to react poorly to that. He also needed more information on how things were going since Head destroyed the kings. If they were truly shattered, if they'd consolidated their power, or if just a small faction was left dedicated to killing him. He needed to know before he started showing back up again. He also wanted to see what he could do about iron in the mine. He still had bruises from the beating head given him, and he wanted to return the favor. He had other revenge he'd rather be focusing on above in Rendhold. But until he found his way out of the pit, iron would be his focus. Jacopo, I need to know what's going on in the rest of the pit. Will you be my eyes? Jacopo opened a single eye to look at Dantes. Can't you make the other rats do it? I'm trying to save favor. Besides, you remember the dwarf that struck us both? Jacopo stretched and flexed his claws. Yes, I want him dead, or at least diminished, and the information we gain could help with that. Jacopo tilted his head, now fully awake. What do you need? I need you to travel through to the Undermarket, then into dwarf territory. Listen to a few conversations, watch some goings-on. He stood and hopped off his small perch. You carried me on the last trip. I will carry you on this one. You sure I'm not too heavy? Asked Dantes with a half-smile. Jacopo regarded him with a blank stare. Dantes shrugged and laid on his bed, focusing on seeing what Jacopo was seeing. There was a kind of handshake when his attention arrived at the rat's mind, an acknowledgement that Jacopo knew that he was there. Jacopo scurried quickly out of the cave and began making his way toward the collard. He stayed mostly in cracks in the walls, or traveling through narrow passages too small for anything except other rats and those few roaches brave or stupid enough to travel in rat tunnels. Dantes could feel the cold stone as Jacopo's feet touched it, and even felt the strain as he squeezed through some of the narrower holes to reach his destination. They reached the opening to the collard territory. There were 2 guards at the entrance instead of the usual one, and both seemed far more focused and aware than those guarding the entrance usually were. Let's look around here a bit. Jacopo heard Dantes' words in his head, and complied, scurrying along the wall past the guards, who had no reason to trouble themselves over a rat. Inside the walls, the collard all seemed more animated than usual, more of Merle's closer disciples. Those who joined him in his exercises were out and about, their massive forms looming over their narrower brothers. Otherwise, things were much the same, aside from a higher tension in the air. A few of them were working on magical formulae or trading books. Some were working to repair the rickety plumbing system that they'd created, and some were gambling. Dantes urged Jacopo toward the gamblers, and he moved toward them carefully, taking position between a pipe and the ground nearby where they were rolling dice. It was difficult to tell at the angle Jacopo was looking at them, but Dantes thought he recognized Pillion, Wayne, and Tell at the table. Pillion rattled dice in a cup, then slammed it onto the ground between the 3 of them. Stolen from its original source, this story is not meant to be on Amazon. Report any sightings. They'll put up a bump of dust, said Tell. I didn't know you were into that stuff, said Wayne. Am not, just happened to find a bit at the Undermarket. In all the commotion, Pillion chuckled. Like I found that flask full of booze, and Wayne found that stack of old books. Exactly like that, said Tell. That whole thing was crazy. That it was, said Wayne. I'm in for a stick of pre-rolled dwarf weed. At novel been at. Can't believe that asshole survived, said Pillion. They'll put up Timur's old grimoire. Pillion removed the cup, and both he and Wayne groaned, while Tell smiled widely. You guys are going to pay for my next visit to Winch at this rate. We'll see how the next roll goes, muttered Wayne. He scratched his beard. How do you think he did it? Well, I know he made the explosion with the magic mirror fragments. He showed me the mirror before everything went down. I'm the one that told him anything but pure elven blood would make it explode. Can't say I expected him to do things the way he did, though. Even knowing that, how'd he get in all the right places and have them go off at the same time? I didn't see him bleed on anything. Is listening to this helpful or just masturbatory? Asked Jacopo internally. Masturbatory so far, but let's give it another minute before moving on. If you'll indulge me. Jacopo said nothing, but stayed where he was. Who cares? The Elfling Kings are done here. That's what's important. Clan Stonedust and the orcs tore them to shreds the moment they saw them faltering. Hopefully whatever of them survived will hunt that asshole down and gut him. You're lucky we like taking your money, or we wouldn't let you talk so much shit, said Wayne, a touch of menace in his voice. Yeah, Dantes is a friend. Lay off, said Tell with decidedly less menace than Wayne had given off. Hard for a half-elf to compete with a half-orc in that department. Whatever, replied Pillion, putting the dice in the cup and starting another roll. Jacopo left after that, moving through the rest of the Collard's territory without any trouble. In the corridors between there and the Collard, he moved through the territory of some of the smaller, non-racial gangs. He didn't pass by close enough to actually hear anything. Those groups tended to be hungry for rat meat, but even at a distance it was clear they were riled up and excited by what had happened the previous day. Voices were being raised, guards were more alert than usual, and goods were moving more freely between all of them. At the undermarket, Jacopo wove between a dwarven guard's legs and immediately climbed the nearest rickety structure. He was far from the only vermin there. Other rats were eating chunks of viscera from the exploded elven kings, and smaller vermin, like roaches, followed in their wake to pick at whatever was left. The cleanup had mostly been left to individual storefronts, who had swept most of the corpses out into the passageways leading to the market, but due to the messy nature of their deaths, they couldn't easily remove everything. Jacopo and Dantes saw a group of halflings, dwarves, gnomes, and a few kobolds all having a discussion toward the center of the market. Some of them were talking to sellers, others to gang members and leaders, and even more to each other. Jacopo moved across rooftops until he was close enough to hear one of the conversations between a halfling and a gnome on the outskirts of the group. Obviously, in the short term, our profits are going to be down, but it's hard to say how things will be without the kings. They definitely spent a lot at our bars, but let's be honest, they started so much trouble that it cost us a lot of business as well. Not to mention that they had those damned magic mirrors, so they weren't as reliant on us as the other gangs. Has the council said anything about what they're going to do about the shakeup? Well, I heard that they're considering putting a hit out on the guy that attacked the kings. Dantes, or whatever his name is, for the damage he did to the market? Yeah, but they're torn on it. Really? Yeah. On the one hand, violence in the markets at a large scale like this, it's bad for business. And on the other hand, the kings were a bunch of knife-eared assholes, and for the most part, the council hated them. The halfling shook his head. I mean, who knows if the guy even survived? Council could just be wasting their time. The gnome shrugged, then gestured for the halfling to move a few steps away from the business in the center of the market. You, got any dust? Yeah. Skim some off the newest shipment. Need a hit? Jacopo moved on from them. Neither he nor Dantes were interested in watching two small folk get high. They moved out to the edges of the undermarket, where it connected to Clan's Stone Dust territory, catching a few more snippets of conversation along the way, and slunk into the dwarven halls. Jacopo moved through the tight dwarven halls quickly and quietly. There were no cracks in the walls for him to slink through, so instead he had to rely on the shadows in order to make his way through. Dwarven dark vision may have made that a problem, but because they lined their halls with braziers that cast harsh light, they may as well have had human eyesight. A price they paid for aesthetics. This was an insight that Jacopo had thanks to his connections with Dantes rather than independently. Head noticed Head had a lot of those kinds of insights since they'd been bonded. The vast majority meant nothing to him. Even this one wasn't vital in his mind. Who cared why the dwarves couldn't see him? Who cared that they were called dwarves? What mattered was that he could move quickly and quietly past them, though even the reasons he was there were still confusing to him. When Dantes had explained revenge to him, he had felt very strongly that it was something that he wanted. In the past, when another rat had stolen from him, or a human had attempted to trap him or threw a rock his way, Head felt no such feelings, but since being connected to Dantes, Head felt strongly about every slight, and the memory of his near death at the hands of Iron in the mine made his blood boil. He wove through a few of the tunnels, hiding against the wall when a dwarf loaded down with goods made his way through to the undermarket. He passed by a few more as he began moving through the maze-like halls of dwarven territory. One was dragging a bound elf around, another was hauling stone, and a third was vomiting in the corner, reeking of alcohol nearly as strongly as Mez had been when Head seen him earlier. Jacopo sniffed the air. He smelled food and drink nearby. Dantes urged him in that direction. The last time Head seen Iron, it was on a throne in their hall. There was a good chance that's where they'd find him this time. Jacopo made his way in that direction, his near silent footfalls further muffled by the sounds of drinking and cheer. The room was much better lit than the rest of the hall, but Jacopo had the advantage of everyone being thoroughly focused on their food and drink. There were more than 24 dwarves inside, most of them with well-decorated beards that marked them as high up in their clan. Iron himself was nowhere to be found. Jacopo sniffed the air as he scurried into the protective shade of a stone table. They were eating some mixture of mushrooms, skitterling, and broth. Dwarven cuisine was a cultural experience that Dantes had always done his damnedest to avoid, particularly since elements of it would kill him. But he found himself sharing Jacopo's hunger for it while he was watching through his eyes and smelling the rich scents through his snout. The room was loud, but it only took a few moments for Jacopo's ears to filter everything down into individual conversations as he scurried around and took a moment to nibble at a small spill of their stew. Damn the knife-eared bastards. Good riddance to them. A bunch of assholes. Remember the time one of them stabbed me between the ribs? I remember the ones that stabbed you through the cheek, but not the ribs. That was a halfling, the one I cheated with loaded dice. Oh yeah, why did the elf stab you? I pissed on their boots while they were walking past. Seems like a bit much to stab someone over. A beating, sure, but a stabbing? They took themselves way too seriously. Speaking of taking themselves too seriously, where's Iron? I expected him to be celebrating the raid with the rest of us. He's celebrating back in his quarters with Rock. Getting drunk as friends? You know that's not what they're doing. Why doesn't he just hit up the brothel like the rest of us? The changelings are perfectly capable of making themselves into a fine dwarven woman, or even a human, or hell's a halfling if you're feeling a bit less than traditional. Stole a novel. Please report. His preferences always ran this way, even back in Rendhold. I mean, he had a wife, he did his duties, but he always had a boy on the side. Why do you think he's down here? I thought he got thrown down here because he killed that counselor's son? No, he wasn't the one who did it, but they made him take the fall for it. He accepted it too. Part of what makes him such a good clan head down here. Too few dwarves have a sense of responsibility these days. Too many are born used to the sun on their faces. Makes them weak. I had no idea that's why he was here. It was before your time, lad. Don't worry about it. Jacopo was looking for the next area to move to. Dantes had encouraged him to sit still so that he could listen to the gossip, all of which he filed away for use later. Jacopo wanted to keep moving, though. They left from under that table, scurrying for the next one, then the next. Jacopo encountered a few cousins beneath that one, eating spilled food and drinking spilled drink. He flicked his whiskers in greeting, before moving toward the far end of the room. He knew, because Dantes shared the knowledge with him, that all dwarven halls shared a similar design, and so at that far end there would be a hall that led to the clan leader's inner chambers. He found the back rooms unsealed, and so walked through them. The sound from the main hall became muffled in those rooms, and eventually faded completely as Jacopo worked his way deeper into the inner chambers. There were several empty larger rooms with stone beds filled with hay, or in a few cases, as Jacopo made his way deeper inside, actual feathers covered in cloth. The rooms were all well appointed, but became surprisingly elaborate as they made their way further in, with small trinkets, piles of dust, weed, and tobacco that made Dantes briefly wonder if Jacopo would be able to carry anything back before being reminded both by himself and by Jacopo that was a foolish idea. Had it novel been at. The door to the room at the far end of the hall was slightly cracked, with candlelight flickering from within. Loud snoring was carried out of the room, and halfway down the hall where it reached Jacopo. He moved inside quickly, sharing excitement with Dantes, a thrill that came with skullduggery that he had been used to before his bonding. This room was the best appointed of them all. Intricate dwarven carvings lined the walls. Furniture of stone, carved for the space, filled it, and the bed looked the same as one that may have been on the surface in Rendhold. There was even a wooden cabinet in the corner, a true luxury in the pit. Dante's priorities, sending Jacopo into clan Stone Dust territory, were simple. The first priority was information gathering. The second was locating some way to damage Iron and clan Stone Dust. Dante's first instinct in that regard was to find some item of irons and have Jacopo steal it, and then plant it among another dwarf, or perhaps even find a way to put it in the possession of the orcs to sow strife among them. When Jacopo moved to the top of the wooden cabinet to survey the room, however, another possibility came into play. Iron was laying on his back, with a younger dwarven man with only a few decorations on his beard laying across his chest. They were both asleep, and on a small stone table next to the bed sat Iron's blunderbuss. Dantes hesitated to say anything, thinking of the danger his idea may put Jacopo in. "You are not going to suggest it?" asked Jacopo internally. "I worry about the risk to you. We're linked. I don't want to put you in too much unnecessary danger." "I want to do it," said Jacopo. That gnawing feeling had gotten from Dantes was stronger than it had been before. The hunger for revenge. Dantes felt it too. His hesitation evaporated when he realized that they shared the same feeling on the matter. Jacopo moved to the side table, climbing up easily, his movements silent in comparison to the loud dwarven snoring that was occurring. The blunderbuss wasn't angled quite right, so Jacopo had to move it before firing to maximize the damage it would cause. The blunderbuss was massive to Jacopo, but he grabbed the end and began pulling. It made a loud, scraping noise, but the two dwarves kept snoring undisturbed. Jacopo heaved it just a bit further. "Huh, what's the—" Jacopo froze as Iron sat up briefly and looked around, his eyes half-lidded and bleary. The man that had been laying against him patted his chest a few times, and Iron gradually settled down. Jacopo settled and shimmied around to the trigger. Neither Jacopo nor Dantes had a lot of experience with firearms. They were rare, even on the surface, and had only really been adopted by dwarven artisans and a few enterprising humans. It was because of this that when Jacopo pulled the trigger, he and Dantes didn't even remotely consider the idea of recoil. The blunderbuss fired, and Jacopo was launched with it to the far side of the room, slamming against the wall. A man screamed, though whether it was Iron or his paramour, Jacopo was in no state to determine. His ears were ringing as he took several stumbling steps away from the wall head slammed into. He saw blood beginning to seep from the bed, trickling down the stone frame and onto the ground. He shook his head in an attempt to regain his composure and ran out of the bedroom door and into the hallway. He made it halfway there just as several dwarves came barreling through it. They didn't notice him even though he was in the center of the room. They just ran right for their leader. That didn't mean they didn't pose a danger, though. Jacopo was forced to dodge their heavy boots, the tip of his tail being crushed by one of them. The pain of that made Dantes flinch from his bed back in his cave, feeling discomfort in a limb he didn't have. They scurried down the hallway and into the now empty hall. There was no need to be subtle at this point. The dwarves would all be far too focused on the gunshot they'd just heard, and reacting to the damage it caused rather than a lone rat scurrying around. It wasn't as if they had reason to suspect a rat was involved either. That would take some leaps of logic he didn't think the dwarves were capable of. Dantes and Jacopo both wished they could have actually seen that damage they'd done, to be certain of if they'd killed Iron, or maimed him, or to confirm that they even hit him at all. It was possible that only his bedroom companion had been struck by the brunt of the blast. It was too risky to stick around to be sure, though, especially with the injuries Jacopo had sustained from the gun's recoil. Jacopo made it out of the main dwarven hall, and then out to the corridor between clan Stone Dust territory. Once he was there, the rest of the trip was a matter of muscle memory. He could make it back in his sleep. Dantes opened his eyes. Jacopo was heading back, and likely didn't need him focused on his every move just for that trek. He opened and closed his hands, looking at his slender fingers. That was the longest period had looked through Jacopo's eyes, and the effect was disorienting. He had to remind himself not to get on all fours as he moved from his bed and had a drink of water. Once that was done, he began flexing his new abilities, sensing the life around him and assessing its needs. His plants were still in good shape, not desiring anything since had cared for them so recently. He ran his fingers along the ever-growing moss carpet that was overtaking the stone floor. If he strained his senses, he could feel the state of his garden as well. It craved more blood, but its calls for it were half-hearted as it had been sated so recently. The rats in the garden were still feasting or relaxing after a heavy meal, and the embers of life within the fruit sacks indicated to him that the rats hadn't touched them, just as Head requested. The trip with Jacopo had been a much bigger success than Head expected. He hadn't expected such an excellent opportunity for revenge against Iron, but was grateful that Jacopo had the same desire to take it as he had. Even if they hadn't managed to actually kill him, the wounds they inflicted on him or his companion would at the very least serve as an excellent start. He also knew that the Smallfolk Consortium was conflicted about what to do about him, which gave him the opportunity to take initiative. Finally, he knew that the elves had been scattered by not only his attack, but a series of follow-up raids by the orcs and dwarves. The danger to him from their remnants was reduced, though he had no illusions that it didn't still exist. He needed to set some meetings and make some moves. Unfortunately, he needed to wait until Mez finished the first brew Head requested. Having something tangible to bring into a negotiation would give him much more to stand on than empty promises of future profits. Head sold nothing for a profit before, but that was the group's far less savvy. It would take at least a week, but possibly more to have the brew in hand to start some negotiations. In the meantime, he would keep bringing Mez fruit so that future batches could be produced. All of that was to say he at least had a week to kill. He could do more scouting with Jacopo or the other rats, continue to cultivate his garden, but visiting even collared territory would need to wait since Head likely need to answer to Merle for how things had happened in the Undermarket. Merle was no friend to the elves, but Dantes had put him at enormous risk with his actions, and had no doubt that Head need to answer for it. The narrative has been taken without permission. Report any sightings. Dantes reached out with his senses until he found a cockroach in the corner of his chamber. He unsealed a few small pieces of cracker and slowly approached him. He tried to broadcast his intentions to the insect, and it seemed to work as it didn't scurry away as he approached. He slowly moved his hand toward him and dropped the crumbs directly in front of him. The roach skittered toward the food and began eating. He wasn't certain that what he was doing would lead to the same abilities Head developed with rats, but he had the time and felt it couldn't hurt to try. Rats could get almost anywhere in the pit, but roaches could make it to even those places that rats couldn't. Besides that, he imagined the ability to summon and command roaches would be enormously useful, if only to diversify what he could do. He moved over to where he had his pitcher of water and poured it into the small dish he kept for bathing. He regarded himself for a moment in the reflection. He was gaunt. 5 years of a lack of nourishment had made him shrivel away. Before there had been a ball of wiry, coiled muscle from moving across rooftops and running through alleys. Now that he had access to more food, he began to consider the possibilities of bringing himself back up to something resembling his old self. Head need his strength to keep building on his successes in the pit, and Head needed even more for what would come after. He settled the plan for the next 2 weeks in his mind, working with Mez on brewing as much product as possible, tending the garden and harvesting its fruit, exercise, experimenting more with his abilities, and scouting more with Jacopo and the other rats. He lay back down. The plans were solid, but the day had been long, and for some reason he felt many of Jacopo's exertions as his own, weighing heavily on his body. He could sense that Jacopo was already through the Undermarket and would be back soon. He closed his eyes and let sleep take him. The plan had been perfect. Hit the councilman's shipment of dust and gold while it was being moved from a port. Everyone on the council thought that they were untouchable. They had deals with all of the larger gangs to leave their interests alone and could call upon the city guard at will if they needed to. That meant that their caravan had only the driver and 2 guards. It was brazen and bold, exactly Dante's style. He waited up on the rooftop while Danglars and Gaspard stood in the road, standing over a dead horse and a crashed buggy. They were arguing loudly as the councilman's transport carriage approached. "I don't give a fuck about your damned horse. I was just pulling my buggy when you hauled ass down here and nearly got everyone killed. Who moves a fucking buggy through this part of town? Besides, didn't you hear me yelling, you deaf bastard?" They were improvising more than Dantes had hoped they would, but it couldn't be helped. They were born performers in their own way. The transport stopped just below Dantes, and the guards moved to approach the scene. Gaspard and Danglars kept the argument going until the guards were nearly on top of them. Then they drew daggers and lunged at them. At Novel Benedat. At the same time that they did, that Dantes leapt from the rooftop and onto the roof of the carriage, and Mercedes emerged from a nearby alley with her hand crossbow aimed at the driver, and Mondego manifested in front of the horse with his morning star. "Drop the reins and step away. You never saw us," said Dantes to the driver as the man assessed the situation. The driver simply raised his hands and stepped off the carriage. The moment he was off of it, Mercedes sent a bolt through his skull, and he crumpled. Dantes laughed and moved to the side of the carriage to check on the goods before they moved the carriage somewhere more discreet. The moment he opened the door, he was blasted backward by concussive force and slammed against a warehouse wall. Out of the carriage stepped a bald man with a tight black beard and a staff in one hand. A mage. They hadn't been expecting that. The rest was a blur of running, fireballs exploding overhead, Mercedes climbing the ladder they'd placed in case they needed to make a quick escape. Danglars and Gaspard climbed after Mercedes, practically on top of one another. Then Dantes encouraged Mondego to climb ahead of him. Dantes went up after. He reached the top, saw hands push the top of the ladder away from the roof, the sensation of falling, piercing pain as he landed. He woke up. Dantes slid his hand into the next divot in the wall and pulled himself up, resting his feet between a narrow crack. He looked up, seeing another small divot, and sliding his hand into it, he pulled himself another half a foot. He was about 15 feet off of the ground now, but still felt steady. Had been a second-story man long enough that heights didn't give him any pause. He looked for another handhold higher up, but didn't see one. He looked to the left and saw several more that he could shimmy to. He began doing so, moving with confidence as he slid further to the left, then up, then down a bit more, then back up. He was attempting a reverse of the path had been taking when he started, and enjoyed the freshness of the differences. Once he was done, he began to slowly make his way back down, moving inch by inch until his feet touched the hard stone below. He took several deep breaths and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Dantes had never really trained at anything before. He was familiar with the concept, of course. His father, on one of the few attempts had made to get to know him, had taken him to the arena to see the various gladiators train. It served as a way to spend time with Dantes and to decide who had be gambling on later, a brilliant use of time. Dantes had watched them practice their sword swings or lift heavy stones, finding himself deliriously bored the entire time, and much more interested in watching the noble women watching the gladiators train rather than the gladiators themselves. Even after that had seen Merle and his people weightlifting fairly often as well. It held no appeal to him. He preferred to focus on practical experience as a way to learn, since that's the way Head developed all of his own skills. You couldn't practice pickpocketing, not in any way that mattered. Head learned to climb and run quickly, because Head climbed and run quickly to get away from people Head robbed or wronged. He stole because he needed to do so to survive, and he fought when he had no choice because Head rather be the one doing the hitting than the one being hit. Training had been a privilege of those with the extra time and energy to devote to it. Dantes only just now had the rare combination of both. He squeezed his fingers together, feeling the increased strength of his grip that had developed over the last 2 weeks. He was satisfied to have seen as much progress as he had in that short amount of time. It was almost as if actually having enough food to eat and not needing to constantly be concerned that you might be attacked had a positive benefit on one's health. He moved from a wall to the small pile of food Head placed on a nearby rock. Jacopo slept next to it, having eaten some of the fruit there without asking permission. Other rats sat nearby, eyeing the food scraps near him, but not approaching. Several roaches did the same. Dantes grabbed a peach and several grapes from the stone and threw them into the corner, broadcasting that they were free to take. The vermin didn't hesitate, immediately swarming over it and fighting one another for it. Even with all of the food Dantes already let them have freely, they were always willing to fight for more, an attitude that he respected. He looked at his rat mark. 3 full fangs had been filled, had not only been training his body, but his new abilities as well. He had gotten to the point that he could communicate with the rats at a greater distance, could tell much more exactly how much a task from them would cost him in favor, and could even quickly shift from looking through one's eyes to another and then another without losing focus on what was happening in front of him. He practiced doing so for a moment, observing himself from several different angles before reaching Jacopo, who refused to open his eyes. He chuckled at that as he tucked into his food himself. Had managed to trade some fruit with a nearby kobold for a substantial amount of dried meat. It was mostly rat, and the bit that had been taken from one of the recent drops into the maw. Had been very clear that he wasn't interested in any two-legged fare, but they'd explained to him that a share that would be impossible anyway, as that food was marked for the clan, not for trade. Once he was done eating, he put his shirt and jacket back on, letting Jacopo climb into one of his jacket pockets. He then moved out of the chamber and began walking toward his garden. He could sense a nest of roaches nearby. They weren't hungry, but he could feel their need to expand into new nests as the current one was getting too full and competitive. He couldn't talk to the roaches like he could the rats, but he could communicate with them. It was closer to how he felt the plants, with the only difference being that the roaches' desires translated more directly to needs he understood. He still couldn't order them to do anything, but he could broadcast if he didn't want them to do something. A few of them broke with his requests, and those few were set upon by rats. It was a minor infraction against him in the grand scheme of things, but he couldn't help but keep score no matter how petty things got. If you encounter this story on Amazon, note that it's taken without permission from the author. Report it. He entered the garden. It was now taking up nearly half of the chamber. Large chunks of old stone had broken as the roots of trees slowly spread out, and vines covered the floor. All the leaves were still a vibrant red, and fruit grew readily everywhere. Rats nested heavily in the trees and readily fed on excess fruit, creating a constant flow of the rat god's favor in his direction. He drew his rapier and pricked his wrist with its tip. It was a bit of a dramatic gesture, but the sharpness of the rapier left a much cleaner cut than his shivs had in the past. He fed the garden several drops of his blood, feeling the gratitude of it as he did so. Its many voices giving thanks. When the blood was gone, he felt drained, even though it was only a few drops, but his energy restored itself relatively quickly. He moved to lift 2 fruit sacks head prepared the previous day. They were heavy, but much more manageable than they had been 2 weeks prior. He considered taking only one, since he knew that he would likely be carrying a small cask back, the first taste of what Mez had been brewing, but decided to push himself. He walked along the familiar route, scanning ahead with rats. He ordered along the path ahead of himself, and switching between their senses and his own to stay aware of potential threats. Had encountered nothing more dangerous than a few skitterlings in the last couple of weeks, but that didn't mean an elf hungry for revenge or another giant spider hungry for him couldn't be lying in wait somewhere. He smoothly moved through Mez's worn-down traps and into his brewery. It smelled richly of fruit and alcohol. Mez was about to cap a small barrel as Dantes approached. "Tez, come." He gestured with a claw for Dantes to approach. He complied, and Mez took a small clay cup and scooped some of the barrel's contents inside before holding out to him. Dantes put the sacks of fruit down, but hesitated. Had planned on immediately making his way to the collard after this, and may need his wits about him. At the same time, though, it helped to know what he was working with. At least that was the justification he convinced himself of as he took the cup and drank deeply from it. The taste was not half bad, actually, especially compared to the swill he had gotten used to in the last 5 years. Then the burn of it as he swallowed it down hit, and it felt like Head just had a sip of fire. He coughed and hit himself in the chest. Mez nodded. "You see what I can do when I'm not dealing with fungus and rot, eh?" Dantes nodded, taking a much less justifiable second sip. This is going to make a deal much easier to sell, though it may kill any gnome who attempts to drink a full cup of it. Mez chuckled. "I don't know about that. I've known more than a few gnomes that could outdrink orcs." Dantes nodded. Mez hated orcs. He'd probably tell you that He'd seen a gnome beat one at arm wrestling if you gave him the context in which to mention it. Mez went back to capping the barrel, carefully sliding in the wooden top. He then handed him 2 leather flasks. "These are the samples. Figure they may help." "You not coming?" asked Dantes, testing the weight of the small cask and immediately regretting that Head carried so much fruit there. They definitely need to work out some kind of alternative way to transport the goods. Dantes wanted to train, but he had limits. "No, I have more to brew, more to test. Besides, don't like going that close to the maw. Too many people." Dantes nodded. "All right then, we'll be back with good news. You really can't help but tempt the gods to ruin your day. Well, I got a few on my side. At it novel been at. Mez looked around. "Not in the pit you don't, but good luck anyway. Try not to fuck it up." Dantes chuckled and started moving. He tied the cask up with ropes using a sailor's knot Head picked up at the docks so that he could carry on his back. He let out a slight groan as he stood. His legs were already sore, and he had a long trek before he reached the collard. By the time he reached the edges of collard territory, Dantes' legs were screaming at him. He had considered, roughly halfway there, seeing how much favor and how many rats it would take to move the small cask for him. He decided against it, of course. It was just the impractical thought of an exhausted body. He checked ahead with a few rats and noticed that 2 guards were posted at the entrance. Both were alert and focused on the path Head be traveling down. He took a moment to rest, placing the cask on the ground. He didn't want to look tired when he approached. No reason to show up appearing weak. He pulled a small flask of water from one of his jacket's many pockets and took a long sip. He used rats that surrounded him to keep watch as he did so, making sure no one was approaching from either side. Once he felt rested, he slipped the cask back onto his back and walked languidly, doing his best to make it appear as if it weighed nothing to him. When he came into view, the guards looked at one another, and one of them quickly ran back into collar territory to let them know he was coming. Dantes nodded at the one that remained and walked right past him. "Wait, don't worry, I can get to Merle myself, I know the way." Dantes walked through the large cavern, drawing stairs as he went. It reminded him of when he would walk through Midtown after a successful heist with pockets full of gold. Everyone's eyes were on him, whispers passing between those who watched him as he moved directly to their leader's chamber. He had a rep now, something Head avoided when he first got to the pit, but which a part of him had sorely missed. He liked the stares, enjoyed the whispers too, and he was planning on maximizing them as much as possible while he was in the pit, though when he escaped he planned to go back to a low profile, at least for a little while. It would be easier to target his old gang from the shadows. He stepped up into Merle's chamber just as Merle himself was stepping out of them. Beads of sweat were running down his forehead, and a rag sat across his shoulders. Had been in the middle of a workout. "You got balls, kid. No brains at all, but balls for days." "Merle," said Dantes with a respectful incline of his head. A few of Merle's massive adherents approached from behind, but Dantes stayed still and didn't react. "So, I'm assuming you have something to say? Some deal to strike to make up for the risk you put on us? You sure you're cut off from magic? Seems like you have at least some ability at divination to me." Merle chuckled. Then his face suddenly became serious. "You lied to me about your intentions, took advantage of us, and could have plunged us all into a war that we would have lost. Whatever you have to say better be really fucking good." He gestured with his neck for Dantes to follow him into his chamber, which he did at the urging of the 2 massive men behind him. Once inside, Merle sat on his stone workout bench and fixed Dantes with a stare, waiting for him to speak first. Dantes noticed that he hadn't asked him to remove the rapier at his waist. That was a good sign. "First of all, I'm sorry for the spot I put you in. I offer only one excuse. I felt it was the only possible way I'd survive." Merle stayed silent, but began stroking his beard. "To make it up to you, I have a business proposal that might interest you." Dantes slipped the cask off of his back and placed it on the ground. "I have developed a steady source of high-quality booze." He took the sample flask off his back and tossed it to Merle, who looked back at him and held it back out. Dantes took his meaning and sipped from the flask before handing it back to him. Merle sipped from the flask. Once he was certain Dantes wouldn't start convulsing, he kept his face neutral, but there was a slight twitch to his eyebrow when it hit his throat. "I want to set up a deal to sell it regularly to the Small Folk Consortium. Obviously, I can't move all the product myself, and seeing as you are between me and the undermarket, 50%, said Merle, folding his arms together. of whatever you make from the consortium, and we get some for our own use once a month. Added novel Benedette. The story has been taken without consent. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. Dantes shook his head. Listen, I already guaranteed the brewer 50%. If you take the other 50, they'll be left with nothing. At that point, I'd be better off just taking the longer route through the outskirts and trying to move it all myself. Or maybe take the offer to the kobolds. We could also beat you to death. An empty threat. Dantes could already tell he was too interested to pass up the opportunity. How about 30 for you? And he'll throw in some fruit with the booze you get every month. 40. 35. Merle stroked his beard one more time. Deal. He stood and held his hand out to Dantes. Dante moved forward and took it. Merle squeezed, hard, yanked Dantes toward him. I don't expect any more surprises, understand? Dantes squeezed back. He didn't have Merle's raw strength, but his grip was formidable thanks to the strength of his hands. Merle hit a flash of surprise and a whisper of a smile as their hands separated. I don't want to make any surprises, don't worry. In fact, I was hoping to meet someone from the consortium here to define the terms of the deal. That way it can all be up front with you. Merle nodded. Reasonable. They'll send for one of their representatives. They'll probably manage to send someone within a couple of hours. He turned around and gripped onto the heavy weights he had on the side of his bench and began curling it. We should figure out the details between the two of us before they arrive. He gave it 3 more curls and looked at Dantes more closely. You been working out? After Dantes and Merle had worked everything out, they stepped back out of his sweat-scented chambers and into the cavern proper. It would likely take the consortium a bit longer to send a rep, so he walked through to find the dice game. He received a few nods from Random Collard and a few looks of fear and appreciated them all before he reached the game. The usual suspects were there, Wayne, Tell, Pillion, as well as a couple others he didn't recognize, though they seemed to be on their way out, cursing as Pillion pocketed a few pieces of copper and a well-crafted pipe. Tell noticed him first and stood as he approached. Dantes, Televor, he said, nodding at him. Wayne, Lil Pilly. Dantes, said Wayne, nodding at him. Pillion ignored him, too offended at the name. Dante sat down and put a small bag of dust in front of himself. The same one had stolen from their guard a few weeks prior. Had become more tempted to use it himself, and so was hoping to lose it. The rest of them put their bets in, and Pillion began shaking the dice. So, you work things out with Merle? Asked Wayne. Yeah, he's a reasonable guy. Didn't have much trouble. They all nodded as Pillion put the cup down and showed the first roll before allowing everyone to change their bets if they wanted to. He picked the dice back up and started shaking the cup again. So how did you do it? Asked Tell. Do what? Come on, you know what I'm talking about. How'd you make the explosions happen in the right place at the right time? Did you have some help? Did you rig up some kind of device? Did you just get really lucky? Asked Pillion. They'll tell you exactly how I did it, said Dantes. I did it very carefully. They all waited for him to elaborate, and when he didn't, they just sighed and watched the second roll. Do you want to know what happened with the elves after you left? Dantes nodded. How about my sources? I even heard about what happened to Iron. Lost an eye and a rib from a gun misfiring. That's why I never trusted those things. Yeah, apparently the orcs have started sniffing around their territory and trade. They smell blood, said Wayne. Said you can't join them? Asked Pillion. Wayne shot him a look. If I wanted blood, I'd break you against the wall. Roll the dice. Dantes watched the exchange passively. Wayne didn't enjoy it when anyone engaged in Orcish stereotypes. Dantes personally thought it was a bit funny that he answered them with threats of violence, but that wasn't really his business. They rolled a few more rounds, and Dantes successfully managed to lose and regain his dust before there was a commotion that drew his attention. The consortium had arrived, and they brought 2 elvish bodyguards with them. Had Dantes been focused on something other than the dice game, he may have placed some rats in the tunnels between the Undermarket and the Collard, so that he could keep a closer eye on when the consortium had arrived, seen the elves, and prepared for them. But he had no such foresight, and found himself cursing under his breath. Still, he was in a relatively safe situation overall. The Collard weren't a powerful group, but they could easily handle 2 elves if they needed to, and it wasn't as if the consortium didn't hire other races to be bodyguards. It was just usually kobolds or dwarves. Dantes moved across the chamber toward them, approaching at the same pace that Merle was in order to ensure they'd arrive together by the fountain in the center of the collard's cells. He realized as he approached that the elves were familiar, but he couldn't quite place them until he got closer and heard them speaking to one another. They were the two elves who had nearly found him in the outskirts with Tell. One was older, with white streaks through black hair and a solemn expression emphasized by a scar along his right cheek. The other was clearly younger, with chestnut hair braided down his back and an impudent smirk. Both were wearing blades at their waists, but they made no movement toward them as he came into view. "Looks like you two finally found me," said Dantes, deciding to lean on bluster in service of his budding reputation. The younger the elves squinted. "How do you know?" "Because we got close at some point," said the older of them, cutting him off. "He saw us searching for him, and he put two and two together." He frowned, bringing a thoughtful hand up to his scar. "As a professional, can I ask where you saw us?" "In the large chamber with the pews. I ducked behind a row as I heard you approaching." "I told you. I knew I'd heard footsteps." The older one shrugged. "You should have been more insistent on searching the room then. You're not here to kill me, I assume?" They both opened their mouths to speak, but a gnome stepped between them. "Not unless you attempt to harm me." The gnome was wearing a silk tunic and a gold coin made into a medallion on his neck. He had a shock of white hair, but was otherwise bald, and wore small glasses that made his eyes appear twice as large through the lenses. Dantes nodded at him and held out his hand, Dantes a pleasure. The gnome took his hand and gave it a surprisingly firm shake. "Grimald, they'll reserve judgment until after we've spoken." Dantes put up his hands. "Fair enough." He turned to Merle. "Should we meet in your chamber? Or would you prefer to have an audience?" Merle gestured. "My chamber will be best. ID asked that your bodyguards wait outside, or things will get quite cramped. I don't take up much space. One of them will join me inside, and the other will wait outside." "Fair enough," said Merle with a nod as he turned toward his room. Dantes walked ahead of the gnome and behind Merle. Jacopo peeked out of a small hole in the back of his jacket so that he could watch his back. The elves had new employment, sure, but that didn't mean that the gnome had their loyalty. They could easily be out for revenge. At the same time, Dantes doubted that the gnome would put himself in that much danger for elf revenge, and the consortium agents tended to be savvy enough judges of character that he likely knew whether or not vengeance was what they were after. Whatever the case, Dantes felt off balance, which was likely exactly Grimald's reason for choosing elven bodyguards. They all reached Merle's office. The older of the elves came in, while the younger one stayed outside. They all sat down and settled in, except for the elf that stood behind Grimald in a relaxed stance that reminded Dantes of a stray cat, calm, but ready to react the moment a rat squeaked past him. "Stolen content alert. This content belongs on Royal Road. Report any occurrences." Grimald cleared his throat. "So, Dantes, before we get to any business, I want to know why the consortium should deal with someone who made as much trouble in the undermarket as you did, who cost us valuable profit." Dantes shook his head. "It wasn't me that cost you. It was the kings. I've never made trouble in the undermarket before. I've bought, sold, and traded there, connected friends to the right businesses, and kept my head down. The kings, on the other hand, were constantly disrupting things. They take up space, run some sellers out of business to set up elves in their place, start fights, and they were able to avoid buying a good chunk of goods from you thanks to their mirrors, which I've destroyed. I wouldn't have made that spectacle in the market if they hadn't decided to try and kill me simply because I ran into their leader by accident. Hells, they could have refused my deal and killed me long before things spilled into the undermarket. They made the choice to make it your problem." Dantes paused for a moment and smiled. "Besides all that, I don't see a reason to let what's in the past hurt potential profits in the future." Grimald smirked. "Everything you just said, except that last part, was bullshit. Luckily, that last part was all that matters to me. What's your proposal?" Dantes returned the expression and pulled one of the sample flasks from his jacket, handing it to Grimald. Grimald unsealed it and had a sniff, then he passed it back to the elf, who sniffed it as well, then took a sip. The elf swallowed, then nodded to Grimald and handed it back. Grimald lifted it to his lips and took a sip as well, but kept his face impassive much more successfully than Merle had. So you've come across some booze? It's hardly worth calling in the consortium to sell a bit of that. It's not just a bit. I can guarantee barrels of it every month. Grimold rolled his head side to side. So what? The offer is to sell that to us at a wholesale price, and then we distribute it as needed? Basically, said Merle. There could be some profit in that, but not much for us. We already have steady supplies of booze. Dantes smiled. They had steady supplies of booze, but that was before Head sent rats to scope out their territory. While their Head had them spill, shit in, and generally destroy whatever consortium booze they could access. They had a bit left, enough to sell for the short term, but if the destruction kept up, and it would, they'd be out of a steady supply. Grimold was bluffing to give himself a stronger hand. Not like this, you don't. Besides, having an internal supplier rather than needing to smuggle it down here reduces your risks and overhead, doesn't it? Grimold took off his glasses and polished them for a moment. We may be able to work something out, I suppose. And what is the Collard's place in all of this? They'll handle the logistics side of things. Hauling the booze from the brewer to you in the undermarket. Dante saw a twinkle in the gnome's oversized eyes. I'd it novel been at. Okay then. Before we get started on exact payments, I have to ask, how would you prefer to be paid? Have family on the surface you need us to get coin to? Want a pile of dust? Or weed? Maybe food? I want 60% of it in goods and the rest in coin. That got raised eyebrows from both Merle and Grimold. Coin? Asked Grimold. That's what I said. Which is to say the consortium are the only ones down here that deal in coin. Then you should be delighted to know that a good chunk of what you pay me will make its way back to you. That was a lie, of course. He had other plans for the funds. He didn't want to be starting from scratch when he escaped. I think we can figure something out. Let's get down to exact amounts here. Dante smiled. The hardest part was just beginning, but it was clear that everyone wanted a deal, and as long as the consortium thought of him as a source of profit, he'd be safe to move freely in the undermarket. All he had to focus on in the short term would be making a profit, and in the long run, he could start looking into avenues to escape. Before we get into details, I'd like to offer the first month's supply for free as an apology for the damage done to the undermarket. An honorable gesture. The consortium will remember that. Dantes smiled warmly, knowing full well that the gnome thought he was a fool for that offer. That suited him just fine. After they'd finished an hour of nitty-gritty discussions, everyone shook hands and felt that solid mix of satisfied and dissatisfied that always came with business agreements. Dantes feigned a frown, letting all parties feel that they got the best of him, even though Head just turned the ability to grow fruit with a few drops of blood into a profitable enterprise that would take little daily maintenance, in which all parties thought his cut was lesser than it actually was. When they left the room, Grimold paused for a moment to speak with Merle a bit more about logistics between the undermarket and collar territory, leaving Dantes standing near the gnome's elven guards that had so recently been hunting him. The younger of them turned toward him, but kept his distance, looking him up and down, his eyes pausing at the rapier on his waist. Nice blade, he said with a sneer. Thank you. It was a gift from a very dear friend. You think you're funny, Mutt? I know I am, actually. You're just not the right audience for the joke. Knifed ears sometimes have difficulty hearing the nuances of good humor. It wasn't smart to taunt them, but the continuous sips from the flask of booze throughout the day was making it more difficult to filter himself than Head anticipated. Had become much more of a lightweight in the pit. You fool. The older of the elves put his hand on the younger one's shoulder, giving him pause, then looked at Dantes. Our mirrors. How did you steal one? We have rangers that have led men to war, that can hear any intruder within 100 paces, and the mirrors were always deep in our territory. You have some skill at hiding from your betters, as the lesser races always do, but not the skill to infiltrate our territory. The question gave Dantes pause. Head expected more posturing and back and forth that led to nothing. That was typically how these sorts of interactions went, but the older elf clearly didn't care about short-term revenge. He wanted to know what weakness it was that had led to their loss, so that he could amend it in the future. Dantes gave a smile. I didn't have to steal it. It was given to me. The older and younger elf exchanged a quick glance. Who? Asked the older of the two. Dantes shook his head. Come now, even you two must know the rules down here, even isolated with the other kings like you were. Am no rat. The older elf nodded understanding, had clearly been in the pit a long time and knew the rules at least as well as Dantes did. The younger elf looked at the older one. A traitor? Maybe someone hiding a touch of Orcish blood? Dantes pretended to start saying something, then stopped himself. That caused them to exchange another glance with each other. All right, let's go, said Grimald, having wrapped up his conversation with Merle. The two elves nodded and fell in line behind him as if they hadn't been making comments about the height and weakness of gnomes just a month prior. Such was the power of security and profit. Dantes let himself smile more widely. He doubted the elves would come after him while they were working for the consortium, and he was controlling a substantial stake of the drink coming into the undermarket. And now they'd been more focused on figuring out who betrayed them. A mutt that defended himself from them was deeply offensive to them, but betrayal always stung deeper. Dantes knew that from personal experience. There was the chance that they would see through his deception, but based on their limited information, he didn't see how they could. Them having a traitor in their midst was the only explanation that could possibly make sense from their perspective. The lie would hold at least as long as Dantes kept his own abilities secret. If you encounter this story on Amazon, note that it's taken without permission from the author. Report it. So, when can we pick up the first load? Asked Merle, moving to stand next to him. Today, if you'd like. Mez already has it ready. Some of your men should already know how to reach him. I know Tell does at least. Added Novel Benet. Merle stroked his beard for a moment. You know, it's been quite some time since someone mixed things up down here as much as you have. It kept my head down if ID had a choice. The kings forced me here. Merle nodded. True, but still, your sudden turnaround, all of your mysterious successes, it's almost like magic. He turned his eyes toward Dantes with a last word, his gaze piercing. Dantes smiled. You know, back up on the streets of Rendhold, I was able to steal gold coins from a man's purse without him noticing, leaving the purse intact as I did so. No one else could figure it out, not my mother, not my friends, not my gang. They accused me of using some kind of enchanted item or magic, but do you want to know what it was? Merle stayed silent, waiting, skill, and a bit of luck. Plain and simple. If I had magic, Merle, the first thing I'd do is break all of you out of your collars and have you fly me the fuck out of here. Merle shifted his lower jaw as if literally chewing on what Dantes had said. We'll talk later, Dantes, when we're divvying up profits. Dantes nodded. It was clear Merle didn't fully believe him, which made sense because Dantes was lying. He had considered speaking with Merle or Tell about his abilities, but kept deciding against it. He was fairly certain that his abilities had a trace of magic to them, but even with his limited knowledge, he knew that it wasn't equivalent to what a mage wielded. As a child, he, like so many other dirt-poor whore sons, had hoped that some latent magical ability would manifest within him so that he could escape the streets and join the academy, and had done his research on what that would mean. That research came in handy for some later robberies and scams, but he had never manifested any magical power, and he knew enough to tell that what was happening now was distinct. He was certain he wouldn't be able to remove their collars. Since that was the case, keeping his abilities to himself was the best call, as it was what gave him the largest advantage. Besides, others learning about his powers would immediately put him at risk with the dwarves, not to mention anyone else that would happily make any missing food or coin his responsibility. He lifted a hand in goodbye to Merle. Keep that first cask. A gesture of goodwill. Merle nodded, raising his own hand as they parted. Dantes walked through the college chambers, still enjoying the looks and whispers. When Tell stopped him, Dantes, up for a few more rounds of dice? Maybe a drink since I hear you've got quite the supply. Dantes grabbed the 2 sample flasks from his jacket and tossed them to him. Tell caught one, and the other fell flatly at his feet, but he scooped it up quickly. You can have what's left in those, but I'm heading back for some rest. I'm planning on visiting Sin tomorrow, though, if you want to tag along. Tell lifted his eyebrows. I'm not really, interested in that kind of arrangement. I didn't realize you'd change your mind on the brothel either. I didn't. I'm just visiting her. I owe her a favor. Want to see what she might want from me to pay it off. Oh, in that case, I'll go with you. One big a bit ago at dice, have a decent amount to trade. Want to do it before the next drop into the maw, while I can get better trade for it. Dantes nodded, still impressed with Telephone's adaptability in the pit. Taking advantage of the lean times was common practice, of course, but few Collard ever got savvy enough to take advantage of it. All right, see you then. You can pay me back for the booze of the market once you're done trading. I thought it was a GI. Dantes raised an eyebrow at him. He sighed. Yeah, we'll pay you back then. Dantes held up a hand and walked back into the outskirts toward his cave. He scouted ahead and behind himself with a number of rats. The gold of his rat mark barely regressing as other rats in his garden ate and enjoyed safety from the more dangerous creatures in the pit. He made it back to his cave, had a meal, and set some rats to wake him if anything with two legs got too close. Once that was done, Jacopo leapt out of his jacket, laying on top of a small second bed of rags that Dantes had made for him. Dantes himself followed suit, laying on his own makeshift bed and closing his eyes. He imagined the soreness of his muscles slowly draining from him as he took long, deep breaths. It wasn't long before he fell asleep. Dantes was in a darkness so black that his dark vision couldn't pierce it. He could hear the sounds of skittering in the dark all around him. He could feel the small steps of a million legs all across his body, his arms, his eyelids. Normally the sensation would make him flail in disgust and terror, but in this case it felt like he'd been tucked into a warm blanket. He stayed still, acknowledging, but not struggling against the sensations that surrounded him. You expected this. The voice was a whisper, seeming to be spoken directly into his ear. The words formed with great difficulty. In spite of the roaches that covered his face, he didn't hesitate to open his mouth and speak. "I'd hope to meet you, yes." The legs moving across him sped up slightly. The roaches began to dig into his hair, their antennae tickling his scalp. "You'd blessing?" "Yes," he said as antennae tickled his lips. "Wulb, you're second." "Yes, though I mean no disrespect." The writhing became more erratic in a way that Dantes recognized as laughter. Amusement? He wasn't certain. Where he used Totharat, God's leftovers. "I'm glad you're a good sport about it." "Yes, open mouth wide." Dantes did so without hesitation. He felt a single massive roach climb up his chin and down his throat. He felt its legs move it down his esophagus as it shifted and tore through his throat, slowly toward his right forearm, right above the rat mark. He began to writhe and scream, his big talk overwhelmed by the sheer agony he was experiencing. But he was held down by the weight of the roaches on top of him, and his voice was muffled as they crawled over his mouth. Once the roach reached his arm, he felt a searing pain as if he was being branded from the inside. His own screaming woke him. Dantes clutched his throat, still feeling the tearing sensation there, even though his throat itself was fine. He clenched his teeth back together and forced himself to stop screaming, then took several long, full breaths and raised his arm up to look at it. The rat mark was still there, all four fangs nearly filled with gold on his wrist. A little lower on the inside of his forearm were 3 half circles in the shape of a roach, one for the head and one for each of their wings. One of the wings glowed gold, and the other 2 half circles were dark black. He clenched and unclenched his fists several times, getting used to the feeling of the new mark on his skin. If this pattern continued, he'd start looking a lot more like his father with all of his sailing tattoos. That was not a prospect he relished. At it novel been at. He stood up from his bed and noticed Jacopo was awake and standing on his hind legs, looking at him. "That seemed very unpleasant," said Jacopo. Dantes shrugged. "It's an easy price to pay." He meant it, but he was still rubbing the fresh mark on his inner forearm with a grimace on his face. Jacopo shrugged back and moved next to the food store. Dantes removed the cover and left it. There was no more reason to hide the food. He could simply ask the rats and roaches to leave it alone. Jacopo grabbed several grapes for himself and began gnawing into them with vigor. Dantes watered the mossy carpet that now coated his entire cave, then moved to the fungus to feed and water it in the way that it preferred. It was now covering parts of the ceiling, and he felt its gratitude as he had felt the floors. He sat to eat, running his hands along the green strands of moss. As he moved his hand away from it to grab his food, the moss shifted slightly. He blinked a few times and slowly moved his hand back down toward the moss. It was subtle, but the small ends of it seemed to be straining to reach up to his hand. He focused, trying to will the moss to come closer. It seemed to strain for a moment, but stopped and settled back in. Dantes bit into the apple as he gently ran his hand over the moss. Another avenue to look into. There wasn't a ton of plant life in the pit, but back on the surface, whole parts of the city were completely overgrown, forgotten, and abandoned as Rendhold spread ever outward. Stolen from its original source, this story is not meant to be on Amazon. Report any sightings. He refocused on the roach mark and sent his senses out, detecting an enormous amount of roaches in every possible nook and cranny of the caverns nearby. He summoned 30, testing the amount of favor it would cost. In moments, 30 roaches swarmed across the moss blanket and settled still in front of him, only their antennae shifting to indicate that they were alive. He began moving them in patterns, 5 at a time, monitoring the favor on his forearm. It trickled down, but far more slowly than the same actions would have for rats. He attempted to look through one of their eyes. He immediately felt intense disorientation. He could see himself, Jacopo, the other roaches, the moss on the ground, the walls, all of it all around himself. At the same time, he could sense movement, pressure, temperature, and other sensations through the small hairs on his legs. He broke the connection almost immediately and placed a hand on a wall to steady himself. That would take some getting used to. Had noticed some sensory differences with rats. They couldn't see reds except Jacopo for some reason, and his sense of smell and taste became stronger, but overall it was relatively close to his baseline. This was much harder, however. He gave it a few more tries, but every attempt to orient himself ended in intense discomfort and failure. He decided that it was something he'd need to practice at a later time. Once his experiments were done, the favor had gone down by less than a quarter of what it had started at. He placed the apple core of his breakfast on the ground and let the roaches know that it was theirs, asking them to leave the rest of his food alone. They swarmed the core and began eating greedily, shoving others out of the way in pursuit of a sweet taste of it. Dantes threw on his coat and began going through his usual daily routine as it had been for the last 2 weeks. He climbed while practicing his new powers with the rats and roaches. He then harvested fruit and fed his garden the blood he offered it every day. Once he was done, he took 2 sacks of fruit and took his regular route to Mez. "Have the collard sent for the first collection?" he asked when he reached him, letting the sacks he was carrying drop heavily onto the ground. "Yes, I had it ready for them." One of the men they sent actually lifted an entire barrel, while the others needed many hands. "I was told they enjoyed my brew thoroughly." He made the last statement with clear pride on his face. "How many of them try to offer you a side deal for a bit extra that they could sell on the side?" Mez smiled. "Just one, Vor. Televor or a Rever." Mez shrugged. "No clue. Your names represent nothing. It makes it difficult to remember them." Dantes nodded. They were both blonde half-elves, so it wouldn't do to describe them to Mez for a clearer answer, since he likely hadn't paid that much attention to their looks in the first place. He also didn't feel like investigating further, because if it was Tell, he'd have to beat him or rob him or something along those lines to keep the tally even. He respected the attempt either way, so decided to leave without pressing things further. If he knew it was him, he'd have to do something about it. But as long as he didn't admit, he wouldn't have to retaliate. All of this made complete sense to him. But Jacopo, who now existed as a part of him, was thoroughly confused as the thoughts moved through both of their heads. Dantes opened the sacks of fruit for Mez to inspect while they went over a few additional details. Once he was done, he started moving back through the caverns and crevices of the pit through to the collard. The trek was uneventful, though he had to avoid a half-dozen skitterlings that had taken up residence in one of his usual pathways. Had hoped to be able to communicate with them as he could with roaches, as they just appeared to be a larger variant. But like with the jumping spider had fought, he had no luck. The collard guards greeted him with much friendlier nods this time. It was incredible what a bit of booze and a business deal could do for people's moods. He climbed his way up to Telephone's room, noticing that the dice game wasn't active that day, and smacked the wall a few times to let him know had arrived. Tell peeked out shortly after and smiled. Dantes under market time? He nodded. Tell held up a finger and went back into his cell. There was some shuffling and other noises, and he reappeared dressed in a freshly cleaned robe with a small pouch on his waist along with a shiv that Dantes didn't recognize. Dantes shook his head. The pouch is a bad idea, too easy to steal. Tell smiled more widely. Pouch is a decoy. Learned from some of the older guys how to do some sewing and made some new pockets in my robe. Dantes chuckled. I know you were a deviant back on the surface, but you're swiftly becoming a true bastard down here. I've had good examples to follow. Shall we go? Dantes nodded, and they headed into the path to the undermarket. Dantes and Televor moved through the tunnels between the Collard and the undermarket. It was busy, but not unusually so. It was common for the undermarket to be more active immediately before and immediately after a delivery from the maw. Prisoners were placing bets as to what they thought would happen, trying to scrape together the materials they'd need to make a run for supplies themselves, attempting to make deals with the gangs to ensure they'd be guaranteed some food, or even just drinking because they knew they were as screwed on this drop as they had been with all the previous ones. They passed by a couple of drinking halflings singing arm in arm, a group of haggling dwarves at a booth, and gave a wide berth to a group of 5 orcs that seemed to be going out of their way to start trouble. They reached the brothel, where Sevlin was acting as the lure. She shifted into a dwarven woman with a beautifully braided beard, then a kobold with rainbow scales of every color, and finally, as they approached, she became a young human woman wearing virginal white and an innocent smile. Dantes raised up his hand in greeting. Hey, Sevlin. She nodded at him and blushed. To name, no name. Have you come to pluck this innocent flower? Dantes chuckled. No, that's never really been my thing. I mean, I seduced a noblewoman's daughter once, but that was business more than anything. Tell patted his shoulder. How do you always know who's who? She could have been Sin, and I never would have guessed. Dantes shrugged. No idea, I just can. He turned to Sevlin. Speaking of Sin, though, is she in? I wanted to talk to her for a minute. It's always Sin lately. You never seem to have time for the rest of us, said Sev, her playful pouting shifting briefly in his vision to show the pitch-black eyes and white face of her true form. Sin doesn't use weighted dice or a third arm to hold extra cards behind her back. She pointed her head down, but kept her eyes focused on Dantes as if she had just been scolded. I would never do that. Uh-huh. So is she busy or not? She just finished up with a client, if you want to head back. Sev shifted into a dark-skinned, tall, elvish woman wearing only 2 palm fronds. Thanks, Sev. Don't worry. They'll be back to gamble with you soon. They'll just have to cheat back. She winked, and Dantes and Tell walked past her. I really wish my parents had each named me 2 different things, too. Dantes shrugged. It's only useful in this incredibly specific circumstance, and it has its drawbacks as well. Tell nodded. I mean, I'm grateful they agreed on most things, I suppose. Dantes shrugged. Doesn't seem to matter. We both wound up in the pit anyway. He knocked on Sin's door. Another client already? I've hardly fixed my hair at Novel been at. You can fix your hair in a literal blink of an eye. Dantes, come in. Dantes pushed the door open into Sin's room. It was much the same as it had been the last time he was there, except a bit more disheveled, and whatever perfume she used to mask the scent of her trade had been more recently sprayed. Sin herself was in the shape of a naga, her bare human torso lounging across a snake tail that was coiled in a pile. Who requested that? Asked Dantes with an eyebrow raised. If you encounter this story on Amazon, note that it's taken without permission from the author. Report it. I don't give names, but let's say there's a dwarf that quite enjoys constriction. Her slitted eyes darted to Televor. I don't know that we've met before. Can I get your name? Tel looked a bit disappointed. It's Dash. Dantes smacked him upside the head hard. What the foo? He stopped and blinked. Oh, sorry, Sin. That was a fair play, but we're partially in business together now, and I'd prefer he not become one of your nameless. They weren't directly in business, but he wanted to soften the spoiling of Sin's fun as much as possible. She uncoiled and stretched languidly. It's all right. I didn't expect it to come so close to working, to be honest. Tell seems very smart at times, but also, you don't need to talk as if I'm not here. Dantes looked at him. I won't save you again. That would be unfair to Sin and the other changelings. Really? You let them take my name? Absolutely. The changelings have always been good to me. Sin in particular, I won't disrespect them by denying them that benefit. Sin added legs and molded herself into a short human woman wearing a plain dress, her hair up in a style that had been popular with noble ladies more than a decade ago. That's why we like you, Dantes. You have a phase sense of honor. She cracked her neck. I'm guessing that's why you're here. You guessed correctly. I still owe you a favor. I'm in a place to repay you now. Just want to talk about what would be fair. I have some thoughts, but what do you have to offer? They'll be coming into a steady supply of coin. I can get you a full barrel of booze if you wish, or I can probably maneuver my way into whatever other goods you might want. No, goods don't interest me at the moment. Dantes cursed internally, but kept his expression neutral. Open favors were always trouble, a fact head often taken advantage of. If he could just trade goods, it made an easy, simple exchange. Services were another story. All right then, what do you need? Sin smiled. The orcs have been coming around and making trouble lately, roughing up some of the other changelings, trying to get us to pay them for protection on top of what we already pay up to the consortium. Bold, even for the orcs. She nodded. There used to be a kind of understanding with them. Since our services are provided to all the major gangs, they've always kept things neutral with us in an attempt to not rock the boat. Now that the kings are gone and Clan Stonedust's leader lost his arm and left eye, the orcs are no longer held in check. Dantes frowned. Last he'd heard it was an eye and a rib. Why me? Why not take care of them yourself with your nameless guards? Or have the consortium lean on them? She shook her head. The nameless aren't the most capable fighters, good enough to kick out an overexcited customer, but not take on the orcs in any serious numbers. The consortium is putting off helping us. They seem to be wary of poking the orcs at the moment as well with how much things have shifted. Dantes nodded. This was his fault, but it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. A shake-up would mean opportunities. He just had to find them. I'm just one man, Sin. This is a large ask. I did save your life. You did. Dantes clenched his jaw. He kept his tally clear. He wanted to push for more from her than just to honor the favor. But he knew that wouldn't work for either of them. I'm not sure they'll work with me, but he'll try. Sin nodded. They'll work with the Elf Slayer. I've heard more than enough bedroom gossip about their opinion of you to know that you have their respect. Maybe. He scratched his chin. I have a few things to trade for in the undermarket. Give me some time, and I'll give you an update when I have one. Sin nodded and began shifting into a tall, thin, elven woman with hair long enough to spread completely across the bed behind her. She turned her attention to Televor. Were you planning on shopping with Dantes, Tel, or would you rather spend a bit of time with me? Tel looked at her appreciatively and swallowed. Well, I had been planning on doing some trading first. I did pretty well with the dice the last few weeks. And hey, Dantes, they'll catch up with you later, all right? Dantes nodded, unsurprised by the turn of events. Fine. Just remember that you still owe me for that booze I gave you yesterday. Try not to spend everything. Said Tel, already moving toward the bed. Dantes shook his head and left the room, closing the door behind him. Orcs had certainly dealt with him a lot in the past. His own father was a half-orc, of course, so he had a good grasp on them culturally, but his ancestry could be as much a curse as a boon when it came to interacting with them, particularly when his quarter-elf blood came into play. Had figured out, had made a deal that'd save his life, and now he had to pay it back. He wouldn't leave the debt unpaid. Dantes moved out of the brothel and out onto the narrow streets of the Undermarket. Unlike in collared territory, where everyone knew who he was and their behavior toward him had changed, in the Undermarket he was nondescript enough that no one seemed to recognize him. There were a few glances and whispers, of course, especially when they saw the rapier at his waist, but nowhere near the recognition he received in collared territory. He kept watch on himself, using a few rats he stationed on nearby roofs as he walked anyway. Wouldn't do him any good to get shivved just because he underestimated how much attention he was being paid. He wove past a few sellers aggressively trying to market dried rat, mushrooms, and other foods that would quickly become less valuable after the next supply drop. A few of the shops had shifted around after had blown up several storefronts, but most of them seemed to be in roughly the same place. He was able to find Clay's booth fairly easily as it was in the same place as before, and he was able to sense the living plants that he had potted in and around his booth. Clay himself stood in the middle of it, watering one of the plants carefully with a clay pitcher. Dantes focused his perceptions and noted that the plants he was caring for seemed to want for nothing. Impressive, considering Clay didn't have the same powers of perception as Dantes. Clay finished with the plant he was watering and moved to the next one. He noticed Dantes as he moved, but didn't stop his work. Dantes, Clay, sorry, I haven't been able to bring you more of those mushrooms since our first trade. Clay shrugged. Understandable, considering you ran into trouble with the elves almost immediately after we bargained. He smiled. Seems like you got the better of those knife-eared bastards, though. I had good luck and some decent weed to keep me calm through it. Clay chuckled. That what you're here for? A re-up? Dantes shook his head. I wouldn't be against one, but am mostly here for a different reason. A very particular thing I need to acquire. Clay paused his watering and placed his pitcher on the counter. Go on. What would you say is the largest kind of tree? Clay squinted at the question. Aside from one of the world trees, I presume? Yes, let's say the largest non-magical tree. Clay nodded and brought his hand to his beard, stroking it thoughtfully. That would be a mother's reach, I suppose. They rise from the earth to touch the sky. There are whole forests of them in the west, supposedly. Always wanted to travel to one of them. Be nice to have my head shaded by leaves rather than stone. Dantes raised an eyebrow. That was a very strange perspective for a dwarf to have. What I want is a mother's reach seed. Clay scoffed. Well, let me just check the inventory here. He looked across the counters, lifted the nearest clay pot, and looked beneath it, then looked back at Dantes. Don't seem to have one on hand. Could you give me one, though? You're serious? Yes. I suppose it's possible. There are some herbalists in Rendhold that may have some if I spoke to the right consortium contacts, but why? What do you need them for? I'm going to grow a tree to climb out of the maw. He laughed. Really, what do you need it for? Dantes smiled. It's a bit strange. I just want a piece of something from the surface, from the earth. I want to feel that connection again. As he spoke what he thought was a lie, Dantes sensed some unintentional sincerity in his voice. That was something Head wanted in the past. Now it was a genuine potential means of escape, though a last resort option considering the myriad potential dangers involved. Unauthorized reproduction. This story has been taken without approval. Report sightings. Clay's expression grew serious. I know that isn't a reason that makes much sense down here. No, that's the best reason. They'll see what I can do. The cost will depend heavily on how much of a lift this is, but what kind of offer do you have to make for it? I can start by giving you all the mushrooms I've cultivated since our last meeting. When I get those to you, and you have a better idea of the cost, we can move from there. Deal? Clay nodded, spat in his hand, and held it out. Deal. Dantes spat on his own, and they shook hands in the dwarven custom. Then they parted ways. Dantes did a little more shopping while in the undermarket. He exchanged some fruit for something Head heard of from Merle called whey powder. It looked and smelled vile, but Merle swore to its efficacy in increasing his size and strength, so Dantes thought it was worth a try. Merle and his closest followers maintaining their size despite the nutritional disadvantages in the pit had always been a mystery he hadn't been interested in solving. But now that he was working on increasing his own strength, he needed every advantage he could get, particularly if he would be dealing with the orcs. He noticed, through his own senses and the rat eyes, he kept monitoring things in front and behind him, that he was being followed. It was 3 men, one human, the other 2 different proportions of human, orc, elf, halfling, and dwarf. They were armed, but only as much as the average person in the pit was generally, and they were approaching openly, not sneaking or being careful in their approach. Dantes loosened the rapier at his waist and placed a hand on its hilt, summoning whatever rats and roaches were nearby to sit on standby in the darkness outside the edges of their vision. Then he turned and stood in the middle of a wide corridor carved in strange runes. "Can I help you 3?" he asked, eyeing his shadows closely. The fully human one stepped toward him, showing that his hands were empty as he did so. He was young, with a short, unkempt brown beard and broad frame. "The question is, what can we do for you?" Dantes chuckled. "Oh." The other 2 stepped out next to him, arms folded in an attempt to project strength, but Dantes recognized Youngbloods when he saw them. I'm Jason, that's Jake, and that's Zach. We're the Shadow Cats. We're a gang over on the northeast side of the pit. Run jobs for the consortium mostly. We saw what you did to the kings, and well, won't work with you. Dantes nodded. Had seen this type of thing play out before. Hells had been on the side that they were on now. Up-and-comers looking for work with a bigger fish to increase their own rep. He hadn't realized his own reputation had reached that level yet. It was flattering, but more importantly, it could be useful. Assuming that they weren't complete idiots, though even if they were, that could have a use as well. You got a lead, or is your entire plan to approach me and hope that I've got a job that needs doing? Asked Dantes. Jason's mask of confidence flickered for a moment, telling Dantes everything he needed to know, but before he could begin working on a suitable reply, Dantes cut him off. I do have a job that needs doing. Something minor, but ITLL helped me figure out what you're capable of at Novelbin at. Yeah, there's a gnome named Pillion, one of the collared. I want you to rough him up. Why? He owes you money or something. Dantes shook his head. You don't need to know why. I just want him to receive a light beating, and I don't want to trace back to me. What's the pay? Asked Jake. Dantes marked him as the smart one. No pay for this job, but once it's done, if I'm satisfied with it, it'll give you something profitable to do. Consistent work, if you want it. They all exchanged glances. Jake looked unhappy with the arrangement, but Zach gave Jason a curt nod, showing that he was game. All right, we'll get it done. We'll see. They parted ways, and Dantes briefly followed them with one of the rats as he continued walking on his path back. No pay. You should have pushed for something. Now he won't respect us, won't see us as possible equals, said Jake when they thought they were out of earshot. You heard him. If we do this job, well, hell, give us paid work after. Not like beating up a gnome is going to be tough work anyway. I don't know, a gnome took my uncle's right nut, said Zach. SWHY, he only has sons. Boys come from a left one. Point is, gnomes can be dangerous. Whatever the case, we need to do this, said Jason. You saw him at what was supposed to be his execution. You felt it the same as I did. He's the next big player down here. It's better to take the loss now and follow him to the top than worry about whatever paltry sum he thinks it's worth paying us for beating a gnome. Jake let out a long sigh. Fine, but I ain't fighting him from the front. I'd prefer to keep myself intact. My girl wants daughters. She's definitely left you up there, man. Not like you're ever getting out anyway, remarked Zach. Dantes cut off his connection to the rat and shook his head. That was about what had expected from a gang that had already been thrown into the pit that young. They weren't the brightest, but at least they had intuition and ambition. Sometimes that was all you needed. Dantes made his way into collared chambers, exchanging nods and hellos with those he recognized as he made his way toward the usual location of the dice game, near Telephone's room. The game wasn't happening, but Wayne, who he was looking for anyway, was leaning against the wall, thumbing through an old grimoire. No game today. Wayne carefully took a small bookmark from behind his ear and slid it into the page he was reading before turning his head toward Dantes. Fray not. Tell went with you to the undermarket, and I think Pillion went there as well to see if he could get some booze. Apparently he can't stand the taste of the stuff you turned us on to. Says it's too sweet. That figures, said Dantes, keeping himself from smiling. That put him in prime position for the beating head to send his way. Assuming the Shadow Cats moved quickly. Tell not come back with you? He got distracted by sin. Which kind of sin? Gambling, drinking, whoring? Whoring, the one named Sin. Oh gods, I'll have to hear about him bragging about his exploits again then. As if it's the hardest thing in the world to have a prostitute say your name. I'm glad I've avoided that particular conversation. You should be. They'll talk about just about anything to avoid the boredom down here, but even I have limits. He tucked his book under his arm. Do you want to see if we can round up some boys for a few rolls? I was trying to go through this rust-proofing enchantment, but it's not like I'll actually be able to use it. No dice for me today. I was hoping to get some info from you, though. Got any dust? A little. Dantes patted a pouch in his jacket. Info first, though. All right, go ahead. Do you still keep in touch with any of the orcs you used to run with? Unfortunately, yes. Keep contacts, mostly so Merle can have a contact to hash problems out with. Why? I need a meet. The orcs are trying to put a tax on the brothel, and the consortium isn't backing them up. I owe them, so I wanted to try and get them to back off. Wayne rubbed his chin. Damn, that's bold of them. Good way to piss off the whole pit. Give me some time, 1 week, maybe 2, and it'll set something up with Kester, one of the sergeants. Can't promise they'll listen to you, though. They'll listen. Just bring them to the table for me. If you say so, just make sure you're wearing that sword when you meet them. I'd also consider bringing some muscle if you can find it. They don't respect anything but strength. Wayne was baring his tusks as he spoke, frustration clear in his tone. Dantes reached in his coat and pulled out a small pouch of dust head, kept in case Head wanted to trade anything. At least that's what he told himself. He handed it to Wayne and watched with envy as he licked his pinky and stuck it inside the bag before running a bit of it along his gums, letting out a satisfied sigh. If you come across this story on Amazon, it's taken without permission from the author. Report it. You sure you don't want to have a few rolls before you go? Slim bets, since the supply drop is tomorrow, but there are worse ways to pass the time. Dantes thought about it for a moment. Well, maybe just a few rolls. The next day, Dantes made his way to the maw for the supply drop. He didn't need any supplies. His new sources of food and drink meant he should never have any issues with that ever again. But he did need information. Head considered using a few rats or sending Jacopo into orc territory for more information, what they'd been up to, and their dynamics, but he figured that the best way to see how the hierarchy in the pit had changed would be to watch the supply drop. Dantes kept his hood up and stayed at the edges of the activity, his rapier hidden and shiv at the ready. Even at the outskirts, everyone's blood would be up, and one never knew what might happen. It smelled of sweat and misery, and a few dozen men were already in the maw's opening, some skinny and desperate, and others well-fed and menacing. Around the opening, there were no longer Elfland kings, but several smaller gangs seemed to be trying to make up for the gap. Clan Stonedust had a large, but smaller than usual, force that was noticeably between those smaller gangs and the Collard rather than next to the orcs where they usually stood. The orcs themselves had been given a wide berth, leaving what people might think were gaps to slip through, but Dantes could tell it was a trap, with other orcs behind those gaps ready to take advantage of those that attempted to slip through them. Underestimating orcs was a global pastime. One would look at them and think they're brutish, simple, and violent, and think nothing else. All three of those things were often true, but many of them were also cunning, often brutally so. Violent didn't mean stupid. It just meant they enjoyed taking the quickest solution to problems others might spend far too much time on. Clear them all. Came the shout from the guards above. A few of the people gathered below scattered, but most of them stood their ground. The guards began throwing sacks down into the pit, a few of them rolling down barrels. At one point a sack was thrown into the middle, and a man went for it, only for another sack to slam into his head, snapping his neck. That raised a cheer from the guards above, and wincing from a few below. The orcs were moving while this happened. It was subtle, but the group of them began slowly shifting to one side. Dantes noticed that behind the front line of them, several of the orcs had drawn weapons. Rusty axes, knives, and swords along with heavy clubs. Dantes moved quickly, pushing through the crowd and making his way over to where the Collard were standing. He didn't see Merle, so he approached the most muscular of them, the elf that had so recently told him that the famed method of execution was a sword through the heart. The Collard jumped at his approach at first before they realized it was him. Orbus! Dantes yelled over the commotion, barely remembering the man's name as he reached them. The muscular elf turned his way Dantes. Clear out. Any supplies through here are ours. It was a kind warning. If anyone who hadn't known them had approached, they'd been beaten and robbed immediately. Even the Collard didn't play around on resupply days. The orcs. They're armed. I think they're planning something. Orbus turned to look past the commotion at the center of the pit and see the orcs. He squinted for a moment, and his ears twitched a bit. His eyes widened, and he turned to the men he had gathered. Bolt in, grab the nearest supplies, and retreat. He yelled. The men around him looked confused, but he himself didn't hesitate, running into the pit and grabbing a sack of potatoes, shoving a scrawny, desperate man to the side as he did so. They followed suit shortly after, and roars of protest went out from the smaller gangs and the dwarves. What Orbus had done was a major breach of the delicate etiquette of the pit and its balance. The dwarves' protests quickly turned to screams, however, as the orcs began their assault. They swarmed across the gap between themselves and Clan Stone Dust, a green and gray tide roaring with fury as they smashed into them. Those orcs that had readied their weapons charged first, while those that had hidden them from the front swarmed into the opening to the maw and began tearing into the supplies and those that had been looting them. The element of surprise meant that the majority of the dwarves were slaughtered before they could mount a serious defense, though several of them made a break for it. Dantes didn't stick around to watch in person, instead watching what happened through the eyes of a rat as he made his own retreat. The orcs now controlled most of a supply drop, all of the prisoners that would drop in, and it cleared out a significant chunk of their primary rivals all in one fell swoop. Dantes was impressed. It was a brazen move, but it allowed them to further secure their power now with the vacuum head created by scattering the kings. At it novel been at. Dantes cut off his connection before the guards began feather falling and dropping in the new prisoners. They clearly didn't care what circumstances they threw these people into, and Dantes had no desire to see what the orcs were planning to do to them. As he made his way into the less traveled tunnels he frequented, he clenched his jaw. It was already going to be difficult to honor his favor for sin, but it had just got even harder. That was assuming Wayne even managed to secure him a meeting with them after Dantes stayed off the main paths. But from what he could see through the rats he had watching behind him, the orcs had ceased their assault on the maw itself and started consolidating all of the goods, beating the new prisoners, and generally asserting their newfound dominance. Still, he stayed cautious, weaving through those lesser-known passages until he made it back to collared territory. There were more than a dozen collards standing guard, most of them broad and muscular adherents of Merle's fitness philosophy. Dantes was waved through with serious nods. In the center of the space, the goods the collard had managed to gather were being sorted. They seemed to have had a good haul, which was good considering it may need to last a long time. He heard a voice call from one of the upper chambers as he entered the space proper. "Dantes, come up," said Merle, gesturing for him to approach. Dantes complied, seeing that Merle was standing with Orbus. "Orbus here says you warned him about the orcs. At it novel been at." Dantes nodded. "Thank you. With your warning and his quick thinking, we actually managed to salvage something out of this." He sighed and ran a muscular hand from the top of his forehead all the way down his long white beard. "The orcs have always been aggressive, but I never realized how much the elves and dwarves held them in line. Now, they've got the numbers, the supplies, and very few checks on their power." Dantes nodded along as Merle spoke. There were some obvious answers to the problem in his mind. The collard working with the remnants of the dwarves, the consortium, and the gangs to restore things to the previous status quo being the most obvious. But Merle and his collard had always taken a more separate approach, their attitudes from the academy bleeding into their time in the pit. If Dantes made the suggestion, wouldn't necessarily amount to much. Merle would likely have to come to the conclusion himself, or the consortium might approach him if they couldn't work things out from their own angle. "Did you have any indication of what the orcs were planning that before you went to the supply drop?" asked Merle. Dantes shook his head. "No. I heard they've been ramping things up, looking to expand in different ways, and raiding the dwarves. I figured something bigger might go down, didn't know this would be it." Merle shook his head. "Well, thanks to the warning and the deal we made with the consortium, we should be able to weather this." "Thank you, Dantes." Dantes nodded and walked away from him. In his mind, the collard were actually in a better position than ever before. Even if the orcs controlled every single supply drop from this point forward, the collard as they were had become the second largest gang by default. Though technically the kobolds, or consortium, may be larger, their numbers were just much harder to track, all by virtue of proximity and usefulness to Dantes, though they likely didn't realize that was the reason. He considered the moves he could make against the orcs, but hesitated to make any real choices or set firm paths in his mind. He had only just started his new venture with the consortium and wanted to pocket a healthy amount of profit before things got more disruptive. The orcs' power play may even be beneficial to him. With the average person more desperate for supplies, his own access to them gave him a greater control of the market. Aside from that, orcs like to drink, and if the consortium was still doing good business with them, that sounded like business security for Dantes. The only possible problem was the favor he owed Sin and how to handle it. He moved over to where Wayne was leaning against his cell, watching the supplies get sorted, seeming to watch certain items closely, minding who was picking up what. Seeing who to prioritize inviting to your next dice game? Wayne winked. Something like that. If you're looking for Tell, he's passed out. Wore himself to the bone, apparently. Spares me having to hear him talk about it, though. Not looking for him today. Looking for you. I'm guessing the orcs didn't set up a meet yet? This tale has been pilfered from Royal Road. If found on Amazon, kindly file a report. Wayne's eyebrows furrowed. The strange thing they did. Dantes leaned against the wall next to him. When? In 2 weeks at the Undermarket, the consortium bar there. The meet's with Riker. He's up there, third or fourth to the boss. I wouldn't have expected them to set a meeting at all with what they just did. The impression I got was that they like you. They thought a meeting with you was worth it. Makes sense. They and the elves had always been at each other's throats before. Dantes nodded and reached into one of the pockets of his jacket to pull out a leather flask, handing it to Wayne. For your trouble. Wayne nodded, slipping the flask into a pocket, and Dantes started to walk out of their territory when he heard some exclamations from the other side of it. He turned around and saw a large crowd gathering. Curious, he wandered over and stood at its edge. Eventually, he was able to see that they were gathered around a thoroughly beaten and bloodied Pillion. He suppressed a smile. What happened? Was it the orcs? Asked one of Merle's lieutenants. Pillion shook his head. No clue. 3 guys with cloth wrapped around their faces. I was just in the market, having a drink since that new stuff is such swill. I walked through an alley, and next thing I know, I'm getting the shit beaten out of me. They took my weed, some coin I had, my fucking shoes. It's not like they'd be able to wear them. Dantes smirked. He couldn't help himself. Maybe they needed to shoe a skitterling, and your boots were the perfect fit. Guess they need to rob you 2 more times to have enough, though. Pillion attempted a rude gesture at Dantes, but winced and grasped his hand. Dantes got a few glares for his comment, so he held up his hands and backed away from the group, which had shed by more than half when everyone realized that the attack hadn't involved the orcs. Those few that stayed, Dantes was sure, did so out of obligation more than anything. He supposed it was possible for Pillion to have friends, but only in the same way that it was possible for him to fly a dragon out of the pit. He moved back out into the tunnels and started on his way back to his own piece of the outskirts. He'd have to make sure to give the shadow cats some actual work. The beatings seemed to have been expertly delivered, and stealing the shoes was a delightful touch. Most importantly, they hadn't been identified and didn't do anything to tie it back to him. Had a few options in mind for if they had failed in that instance, most of them ending very unfortunately for them. But their success saved him the trouble and brightened an otherwise complicated day. He made it back to his cave, letting Jacopo out of his jacket where instead of moving to his bed or the food storage, he began making his way out of the cave. Got a date? Asked Dantes, sitting down. Mating, yes. Also murder. Cousin once stole food from me. Feel compelled to harm him. Makes sense to me. Need a hand? I certainly owe you for iron. He shook his head. You can't fit where I would need. Thank you, though. Dantes nodded, and Jacopo began weaving through the pit to his cousin. They were rubbing off on one another, in a good way as far as Dantes figured. He considered having Jacopo go to spy on the orcs ahead of the meet, but he didn't feel as much of a need for skullduggery with them. The orcs weren't stupid, but they were direct. He was fairly certain he could figure out their intentions without relying on his abilities. Besides which, he wanted to see what happened when the Ratmark favor filled completely. It slowed down the further it filled up, and he was at 3½ full fangs. He wasn't certain, but he felt instinctively that something would happen once it was completely filled, and he wanted to know what that was. 2 weeks until his meeting with Riker. 2 weeks to focus on collecting fruit, figuring out what to do with the shadow cats, after making them change their name, which was an obvious priority. 2 weeks to climb, to spy with rats and roaches, to plot with Sin, and to collect his pay from the booze Run had made nearly self-sufficient. He flexed his fingers, tightening and loosening his grip. It wasn't enough. He needed to get out. He needed to be back in Rendhold. Playing power politics in a pit that didn't matter, it was a waste of time. For just a moment, the frustration of it boiled over in him. He flexed his hands more and clenched his jaw, feeling his teeth rip into flesh and his hands clawing into his cousin's soft underbelly. Once the deed was done, he kept eating. No sense letting the meat go to waste. Dantes shook his head, clearing his connection to Jacopo, still tasting copper in his mouth. He loosened his grip and let out a slow breath. Patience had already made it 5 years. He could handle waiting a bit longer. Dantes walked toward the consortium's undermarket bar. He felt good. Had put on even more weight thanks to his climbing routine, easy access to food, and the way Tip had gotten from Earl. On top of that, coin jangled in his pockets from the last 2 deliveries of what Mez had begun calling his bloody brew due to its dull red hue. Only Dantes and Jacopo knew how appropriate the name truly was. Life was horrible overall, but also as good as it had ever been for him since had been thrown into the pit. Dantes shifted his focus to Jacopo, who was already tucked in a wall of the bar, watching it. The shadow cats were already there as well, pretending to be unrelated patrons in the corner, but Riker and his retinue hadn't arrived. That suited him fine, meant that there wasn't an ambush of any kind waiting. He went inside and walked over to where a gnome was standing on top of a stool behind the bar. He held up a finger, and the gnome nodded, pulled out a cup, poured strong red brew into it, and slid it over to him. Dantes took a long, slow sip, enjoying the sweet flavor and burning aftertaste. When he was done, he took a copper from his pocket and slid it across the bar. The gnome took the coin with practiced grace and poured Dantes another round. At it novel been at. Jason attempted a subtle wave, but Dantes ignored it. Jacopo had moved into an alley nearby, and he could see through his eyes that 3 orcs were about to enter. Dantes kept his eyes forward and enjoyed another long, slow sip as they entered. Hierarchy was rarely a difficult thing to determine with orcs. If one was bigger than the others and walking ahead of them, he was in charge. There were a few exceptions here and there, but in this case things adhered closely to stereotypes. Riker was a head and shoulder taller than the other orcs, which put Dantes at about chest height to him. His tusks were capped in iron points. His skin was the deep green of vines, and his eyes were a rich orange color. He had shaved bald, as had the other orcs, and all of them were bricks of muscle. Dantes turned around on his stool and raised his glass to Riker, who gestured with his neck for his men to take a seat at a nearby table without them, then went to the bar to sit next to Dantes, his large frame seeming almost comical on the small bar stool. He gestured for a drink, which the gnome poured without comment, and took a long sip before turning his orange eyes to Dantes. He sized him up for a moment, his eyes running up and down him before he nodded. "Before I hear what you have to say, I need to ask you a question." Dantes nodded. Riker smiled widely, his entire demeanor shifting from intimidating to warm in an instant. How good did it feel to blow those fucking elves up? Dantes looked left and right and leaned in conspiratorially. Better than the last time I had a woman. Riker let out a loud laugh and slapped Dantes on the back, nearly knocking him from the chair. "Oh, I had a feeling I'd like you." He took another sip of his drink. "This stuff, I heard that it was partially your doing as well." Dantes shook his head. "I just connected the right people to each other, that's all. Hey, nothing more valuable than that. No crew, no job, no gang can exist without a guy who puts the pieces of things together." Dantes nodded. He hadn't expected Riker to be so personable. Wayne hadn't given him much of a heads up about what to expect, and so Dantes had been assuming it would be a large orc full of balls, bluster, and rage. So far, Riker only met 2 of those predicted criteria. The story has been taken without consent. If you see on Amazon, report the incident. "Can I ask why you came to meet me?" Wayne initially said it would probably be Kester. Riker finished his drink. "I wanted to meet the guy who took care of the pit's elf problem in person." He gestured for another drink. "I also wanted to see if you were up to joining us." Dantes briefly lost control of his expression, and his eyebrows shot up. "Is that such a surprise? Are you going to pretend it's not?" asked Dantes. The orc gang was probably the most open to recruiting half or quarter-blooded orcs into its ranks without any prejudice, but not when they had elven or dwarven blood. Dantes had both, though only the elvish was obvious. Riker, quarter orc, half orc doesn't matter. Society sees you as an orc no matter what other blood has mixed with it, whether we want them to or not. Besides which, we're a what-do-you-call-eat meritocracy. You seem good at killing and setting things up. Even Blood gave me the sign off to see if you were interested. Dantes brought his expression back under control, though he found it was easy to give an affable smile. He liked Riker, he seemed reasonable, and he didn't detect any insincerity either. He hadn't expected this, particularly not Blood, their chief, to be interested in him joining up. This was good. He could use it. No need to make a decision now. Hell, would be willing to work with you even if you don't join up. He took another sip of his freshly refreshed drink. But anyway, what did you want? Why the meat? Dantes took a short sip of his own drink. The witch wench, I've heard you've been trying to get them to start paying up to you. Riker nodded. Yeah, we're doing a bit of flexing here and there. The changelings have had it easy for a while. I'm sure they've got the goods to pay us. He smirked and lightly hit Dantes' arm with his elbow. And if they don't, they've got other ways to stay out of debt with us. Dantes kept his smile, but immediately felt his opinion of Riker drop by half. Well, I get along well with them. Gamble with them. Drink, you know. I was hoping to talk to you about going easy on them, maybe dropping the ask, or negotiating something different. Riker kept his smile, but shook his head. Afraid not, my friend. Taking the witch wench and a few other businesses that's on Blood's orders. No turning that around now. He picked at an iron-capped tusk with his index finger. Come on, there's always a deal to be made. I'm sure if you worked with them, it would wind up being beneficial for everyone. Riker laughed. They're just Horror's elf killer. They're only good for one thing. Smart guy like you knows that. There went the other half of his opinion of Riker. Still, he kept up his smile. Yeah, whores are whores, but I lost a bet and owed one of them a favor. You understand, I'm sure. Riker nodded slowly. Honorable too, even a whore's. You really just sell yourself more and more as we talk. Dantes rubbed his chin as if deep in thought. You know, there might be a way I can make things go easier for you with the changelings. Maybe even get some profit out of it for the both of us. Oh, Riker gave a conspiratorial look. Well, they trust me, and as far as they know, I'm on their side. I could talk to them, convince them not to resist, maybe even get them to agree to the deal verbally. Have them bound to listen to you and the other orcs by Fey law. And what would you get out of that? A cut, of course, and maybe Blood makes me one of his lieutenants when it's all over. Riker nodded, pointing a thick finger at him. You're bold. If I didn't know any better, I'd think you were full-blooded, straight from suckling off an Orcish tit. Well, what I do in private is my own business, isn't it? Riker let out a big, full laugh. All right, a guy with jokes like you needs more than just a brief meet. You, me, and my boys are going to be getting some serious drinking done. He gestured to his men at the table who moved up to the bar. Then he gestured to the shadow cats. Your bodyguards, too. They're welcome to join us, too. That obvious, asked Dantes. Let's just say, those boys are greener than I am. I had them nailed the moment I walked in. Dantes laughed and waved them up. You heard the man. Let's all drink. They all got a fresh cup and raised them high once before they chugged the first one down. As expected of a bar full of criminals, not one of them even winced as it burned down their throats. Dantes kept making jokes and sharing drinks until the day was done. He needed them to trust him as much as possible before he slipped a knife between their ribs. Dantes awoke the next day with a splitting headache. He laid awake with his eyes closed for what must have been at least an hour. Then he attempted to sit up. The moment he was upright, he vomited, narrowly missing his bed. He stayed still for a few moments, then wiped his mouth with his bare hand and crawled over to the water pitcher, his hands and knees cushioned by the bed of moss that now covered everything in the cave. He actually felt a bit better after expelling that bit of poison. He took slow, steady sips of water, then moved the rock that covered his food and removed some hardtack. It wasn't the meal he'd pick first in any other situation, but in this case, it was exactly what he needed. Jacopo grabbed himself some food from the uncovered hole and began to chew it much more loudly than Dantes would prefer. He looked up at him. This suffering, you chose it? Yes. Why? Needed someone to trust me as much as possible. Had to pretend to be friendly. Wasn't too hard. He was a friendly guy, just also happens to be a piece of shit. He took another sip. Jacopo shrugged. At this point, the gesture looked nearly human. You chose it. You deserve it. Oh, I probably deserve worse. Luckily, what I deserve doesn't matter. He took several more sips of water and choked down more hardtack. He still needed to take the fruit sacks to Mez. Then he needed to contact Sin, and on top of that had been meaning to check in with Clay to see how much luck Head had acquiring a Mother's Reach seed. Now he needed to do all of that with a splitting headache and raw stomach. He did himself the grace of forgetting about his exercise for the day. He sent permission to the roaches to clean up his puke and began dragging himself to his garden, sensing their gratitude as they cleaned his cavern for him. His garden had grown massive and unruly. Red bushes, trees, and vines all fought for space in a large chamber. Their roots had turned the hard stone to rubble and grown deep into dirt that hadn't been seen for hundreds of years. He heard a chorus of requests for his blood from the plants all around him. Those had been growing louder and louder as the garden had grown. Rats ate freely of the rotted fruit Dantes couldn't eat or use, and roaches fed on whatever remained that even the rats wouldn't touch. Dantes drew his rapier and opened the same cut on his arm had been opening every day, feeding the garden a steady stream of blood until the cries for it at least grew quieter. He had known in the back of his mind that as the garden grew it might require more of him. Soon Head need to find another way to feed it. He couldn't compensate for the lack of sunlight forever. He moved to the already packed fruit sack for the day. Lately had been taking 2 every time, but today he decided 1 would be enough. When Dantes arrived, Mez was leaning over a large cauldron, stirring the ingredients inside of it. His equipment seemed to have had a complete overhaul since he and Dantes had begun working together. Had even managed to acquire some glass containers of beakers. The logistics of getting those things down to the pit without them breaking were staggering. He still looked a bit malnourished and wore dirty rags, but he just had different priorities than most. Mez didn't even bother looking up. Hungover? Dantes threw the sack to the ground and let out a confirming grunt. A greasy slice of beef and a raw egg washed down with a light beer would fix you right up. Are you offering? I got a bit of stringy rat, a snake egg, and booze that would kill most gnomes after a sip. It'll pass, but thank you. Dantes went to leave, but stopped when Mez spoke. Oh, speaking of gnomes, there was one here a few days ago asking about you. I forgot to mention, if you spot this story on Amazon, know that it has been stolen. Report the violation. What was his name? Don't remember. Mez continued to stir, but didn't look up. Dantes moved over to him and waved a hand in front of him to get his full attention. Mez looked up and blinked as if just remembering there was an entire spectrum of reality outside of the bubbling contents of his cauldron. What did he look like? Short. Dantes clenched his jaw, but kept himself in check. Mez had been in the zone since Dantes had started to bring him fresh supplies so constantly. His focus was part of what Dantes liked about him. Had to take the bad with the good. Was he traveling with elves? Oh yeah, he was. What did he ask you? He wanted to know where the fruit came from. And what did you tell him? That I didn't know and didn't care. Dantes nodded. All right, thanks for the heads up. He turned toward the exit to Mez Cave. See you tomorrow. Later, Tez. He moved through the tunnels, no longer on hungover autopilot. He sent rats ahead and behind him so that he could watch for anyone approaching or following. Grimald was trying to determine where he got the fruit. That meant he was trying to cut him out of the process. It made sense. All he provided was fruit. Mez did the brewing, and the collard handled the logistics. Even they may be cut out if the consortium got rid of him, though. They could definitely handle the logistics themselves. Had have to be more cautious with his deliveries. Mez couldn't sell him out since he didn't know where the fruit came from. That meant that Grimald's next step would likely be to interview other people that might know, or to try and track him. Given the fact that he had 2 elvish trackers as bodyguards that had a vendetta against him, he bet on the second option. He needed to be much more careful. He went around his own cave and headed for the undermarket. He was more alert and focused now that there was a potential threat. He needed to keep pushing forward, even if his head felt like Head accidentally sheathed his rapier between his ears. He reached collared territory, where the guard waved him through without trouble. They were still on higher alert than before, but as far as he knew, they hadn't had any more incidents with the orcs. A few of the smaller gangs had gotten some trouble from them, but the Collard were on almost the opposite end of the prison, and their neutrality meant that the orcs had little reason to bother with them, at least for the moment. Dantes, said Wayne, spotting him as he moved past the fountain in the center of the chamber. He stopped and waited for Wayne to approach. Hey, Wayne, can't gamble today. I have an incredible hangover. Wayne chuckled. I don't mind if you gamble hungover. He leaned against the cell wall. Were you drinking because the meet went poorly? No, the meet went well. Actually, Wayne frowned and gestured for Dantes to move off the main path to speak. Really? They were willing to work with you? Dantes cursed internally. He hadn't considered how much he should share with Wayne. The orcs needed to think he was going to side with them, but Wayne and the Collard would almost certainly be wary of him working with the orcs after what had happened during the last supply drop. No, but they didn't kill me. Unless you count forcing me to drink with them as an attempted murder. Wayne nodded. Well, I'm sorry it didn't go well. Yeah, that's why I'm headed to the Undermarket. I need to tell Sin what happened. Wayne nodded. Hey, have Grimald and his elves been by at all? Wayne shook his head. No, not since they were here to meet with you and Merle. We pick up our portion of the profits from them in the Undermarket. Have they been asking questions about me when people go there? Not from what I've heard, but I haven't been paying much attention, to be honest. That's fine. Want to come with me to the Undermarket? Wouldn't mind some company. No, Pillion cleaned me out this morning. He batted his eyelashes a bit. Unless you'd like to buy a few things for me. Sorry, I'd rather save, so I can pay your family the dowry it takes to marry you. Wayne chuckled and gave him the dainty wave of a high-born woman. Until then, Dantes waved goodbye and went the rest of the way to the Undermarket. Jacopo crawled around his jacket until he was perched on his shoulder. Do you really intend to marry that orc? Dantes smiled. Not unless I'm down here 50 more years. It was just a joke. Dantes felt Jacopo comb through his mind for a few moments. Ah, you use these often. Yeah, I'm surprised this is the first time you're asking me about it. I often ignore parts of what you say. Can't say I blame you. To you, a lot of what I talk about must seem meaningless and dull. Added Novel Benedette. Yes. Why the sudden curiosity? I've noticed it puts those around you at ease. Makes them more likely to listen to you. It is a tool. Yes and no. I can use it like one, but I also do it for its own sake. Sometimes people make jokes without even thinking about it. Sometimes people tell jokes just for themselves. Jacopo broadcast an emotion that reminded Dantes of a sigh. I ask one question and gain a dozen more. It's all right. You don't need to understand humor. You're naturally funny. Jacopo squeaked acknowledgement and crawled back in his pouch in the back of Dantes' coat. The Undermarket was full of the stench of booze and sweat. All of the various small bars scattered throughout it were full of cheerful drunken orcs, still high off their victory at the supply drop even weeks later, and, most likely, fistfuls of dust and weed as well. Dantes didn't attempt to keep a low profile as he typically did. Instead, he pulled his hood down and walked with his rapier clearly visible at his waist. He exchanged nods with several orcs as he walked through, and even had to decline 2 offers of free drinks. Even if he wasn't busy, the idea of drinking again so soon after the previous day's debauchery filled him with dread. Still, he kept all smiles and friendly gestures. The orcs needed to believe he was on their side. Before he headed to the Witch Wench, he made a side trip to Clay's booth. He had just rearranged his plants, and Dantes took the time to admire them as he waited for Clay to complete a transaction with a halfling for a bit of weed. His plants felt content and well cared for, as always, aside from being just a bit parched. Dantes continued to be impressed by his ability to accomplish things as a gardener with limited means that he could only do with the abilities he had gained. Once Clay was done, he turned his attention to Dantes. Dantes, hey, you here for the dash? He gestured vaguely, as if he couldn't quite remember the word. The seed, yes, had any luck? Clay nodded. Yes, actually. I spoke with some of my consortium contacts. They told me it was the oddest request they'd ever received, but they managed to get one for me. Had to call an extra favor that'll probably cost my sister a couple silver up at her bar in Midtown. You're from Midtown? He shook his head. No, I'm from an old logging town in the south. Family moved here when the trees ran out. Sister and I opened businesses. Hers was legit, mine not so much. Anyway, he reached toward his beard, parting the mushroom and moss-ridden strands of hair to put his hand into it and pull out a fist-sized orb of dark brown with a rough texture. The moment it came into view, Dantes could feel its presence. Had felt faint life in seeds before, but the life emanating from this seed wasn't faint at all. It was thrumming with an intense vitality, the desire to grow, the will to reach the heavens. He began to reach toward it unconsciously, and Clay snatched it back. Come on, you know the rules. We haven't even started a bargain. Dantes shook his head, breaking his concentration on the seed. You're right. Sorry, too much drink yesterday. Clay shook his head. That's why I stick to weed. No hangovers from it yet. Dantes shrugged. So, you said it cost your sister a couple silver. How about I give you 5 gold right here? He shook his head. It will cost my sister 2 silver, but already cost me a favor and a bag of weed. 5 gold coins down here barely meets the value of 2 silver coins back up top. Come on, 5 gold down here is worth way more than that. I was being generous. Maybe 5 to trade with the small fucks, but for anyone else in the undermarket, it's nearly useless. 3 gold and a full skin of bloody brew. Clay scratched his beard. I think that's closer, but this seed, I don't know, maybe I'd be better off holding on to it. It fits so nicely in my beard. Fine, 5 gold pieces, a full skin of brew, and it'll hook you up with the collar for as much fresh water for your plants as you can need. That last part of the offer was a gamble, but considering Clay's plants felt a bit thirsty, something Head never felt them complain about before, he thought it would be worth a shot. The narrative has been taken without permission. Report any sightings. Clay kept his face impassive for a moment, then nodded. All right, he'll take the gold up front, and you can bring me the rest later. Dante smiled and handed him the gold. He had, in some ways, been had. That much for a seed would seem ridiculous to anyone except Clay, but the potential use he had for it made it worth the price, especially with the resources he had access to being much more abundant than they had been. Clay handed him the seed, and he tucked it into his jacket, feeling the life within it pulse like a heartbeat. Dantes looked around the rest of Clay's booth, his eyes falling on the large pile of weed at the end. Any chance you'd be willing to part with most of that as well? Dantes made his way to the brothel at a slower pace than he usually walked. He felt weighed down, and not by the large seed Head just purchased. He was feeling drawn to the easy path. He could work to convince the changelings to just do what the orcs wanted, get himself protection and goods in return, and maybe even be able to soften the treatment the changelings receive in the process. It wasn't a bad plan, and it would give him the freedom to focus more on his own escape. The seed was a backup plan. Ideally, He'd be able to work with the consortium or even some of the guards the next time they took a trek into the pit, but he still needed more resources before he could even broach the subject. He didn't owe Sin anything more than an attempt to negotiate on their behalf, but then he heard the words Riker had said. They're just whores, and his jaw clenched. No, he wouldn't work with them. He'd take the riskier option. Besides, in the long run, it would likely be more profitable for him. Besides which, he didn't want to join the orcs, didn't want to join any gang. He wanted to lead one. It was Selvin at the front again. She smiled at him as he approached, but behind the smile her shape flickered and he saw the pale, long creature. She actually was scowling at him. She shifted into a large human woman spilling out of a milkmaid outfit. Hello there, Dantes. Looking for a roll in the hay? I'd take a night of sleeping on a hay bed with no rolling, if that's on offer. Afraid not. Time on my bed is money. Dantes shrugged. Oh well. Is Sin in? Selvin nodded. Yeah, and she's between clients now. She smiled. Not literally, you can head back. Dantes nodded, feeling a bit suspicious as he moved past her and into the brothel itself. She hadn't done nearly the same amount of flirting as she usually did, and he could detect a stiffness to her transformation that felt forced. He hadn't noticed anyone tailing him through his rats, so he didn't think she was acting off for his benefit. He wondered if he owed her money or had cost her a client, but he couldn't recall anything like that. He had in his mind that Head asked Sin. The moment he walked into the room, he found himself surrounded by a half-dozen men. The one behind him closed the door. All of them had no pupils and stared at him dead-eyed. They were nameless. He looked across the room where he saw Sin sitting at the edge of her bed. Her usual smile wasn't on either her fake or real face, and instead she just regarded him with a frown and sad eyes. She was in the shape of a young human woman with wide eyes and long auburn hair that fell past her shoulders in thick curls. Sin said Dantes simply, trying to buy some time to figure out what was going on. "Go ahead," she said, tilting her head. "Pitch me changelings being bound to the orcs. Explain how working with you will make it less painful for us, while you join their gang with a new source of profit lining your pockets." Dantes nodded slowly. Someone had talked to her, or another changeling, about the meeting Head had with Riker. It made sense that Sin would be keeping tabs on what he was doing, not to mention anything to do with the orcs since they began trying to extort them. If that was my plan, this reaction would be more than fair. Sin shook her head. "There's no reason to lie. Loose-lipped Orcish clients and the gnome bartender have both confirmed it. Did you consider that I was lying for an even bigger con at Novel Benedat?" Sin's form flickered for a moment, but her actual expression didn't change. "I need the orcs' trust, so I had to lean into things. Make them think I was completely on their side and willing to help them against you." Sin stayed silent. Dantes looked around and gestured at the nameless around the room. "Listen, I understand you being incredulous. We've known each other for a while. I know changelings value their freedom, which they lose so much of when they get down here. The idea of further restrictions must be beyond bearing for you. But in this case, I'm on your side." Sin tilted her head and smiled. "Good. I was hoping that was the case." She gestured to the nameless, and they walked out the door. "Still, we don't enjoy broken promises, and had no way to bind you to them, so the other changelings insisted." Dantes took a deep breath, trying to calm his dancing pulse. "So," said Sin, standing up and taking the form of a large Orcish woman before placing her hand on the wall behind him so she could look down at him. "What's your plan?" Dantes smiled, glad to see Sin's mood switch back to playful so easily. "Well, it's got a lot of moving parts, but hey-race the gist of it." Jacopo watched as the orcs filtered in one by one. The smell of smoke and drink was heavy in the air. Dantes had given the weed Head bought from Clay to the orcs, so that they could get high as well as drunk while their deal with the changelings was completed. Jacopo watched as Dantes greeted each of the orcs as they entered, handing them a drink, making a quick-witted joke, and telling them to enjoy themselves. There were no bouncers, and the nameless had been moved to their usual quarters for the night so that the orcs could be sure of their safety. A few orcs even stood guard outside in case it was a trap, which had been temporarily expanded with the curtains and room separations removed and a bar installed. The changelings themselves drifted around the room in various forms that Two Legs found enticing. He saw a gnome woman with breasts as big as her head sitting on the lap of a massive orc giggling, an Orcish woman arm wrestling with an Orcish man surrounded by cheers, a haughty elf woman protesting sultrily as she was pursued around the room by a dark gray half-orc with a smile plastered on his face. Jacopo didn't fully understand everything that was happening, but he relied on Dante's thoughts to keep general track. He began moving across the beams that held up the rickety ceiling, keeping track of everyone's movements for Dantes. Riker himself hadn't yet arrived, but there were around 7 orc sergeants and more than 20 of their men. It was a sizable chunk of the orcs' forces, maybe a third overall. Hard for anyone to resist a party with drugs, booze, and women all shared freely, especially in a prison where all three things were hard to come by. Jacopo moved closer to the orc and gnome that were sitting in the corner, his ears perking up to listen to what they were saying. "So since we're going to be working for you, what's Riker like?" she asked as she traced a pattern on his chest with her finger. "Es a good orc. Strong, friendly, make sure we're all fed and drunk. Tells great jokes. So you'd say you'd trust him to make decisions for you?" "Yeah, I suppose." He took another long drink. "You may not be happy with it now, but he'll take good care of you, just like he does us." Jacopo skittered across a few more beams, catching up to where the changeling in the shape of a haughty elf had been cornered by the orc that had been pursuing her, who was now kissing her neck. "I could never lay with someone who follows a weak leader," she said, pushing his head away in a manner that was clearly for show. Riker ain't weak. He's a good leader." He smiled wide, showing his tusks. "Only blood is stronger." She pouted. "So, You're saying you trust him with your life? With your name. He lifted his head back up from her neck. Yeah, I suppose so, but let's focus on me, huh? Jacopo could sense Dante's appreciation at the work that the changelings were doing, as well as his overall disappointment with the lack of savvy the majority of orcs were showing. He supposed anyone's judgment would be suspect in this situation, but still he was finding himself more sure that his decision to work against the orcs was the superior one. Jacopo agreed, but more because he preferred the changelings to the orcs overall. They tended to ignore rodents. Orcs were more likely to simply stomp or eat them if they could. Had lost many a cousin and one sister that way. Jacopo began moving across the room, hearing a few dozen more conversations that all seemed to be going roughly the same way, with only a couple of the orcs not answering the question the way they needed to, though the changeling continued to work on them. Before he could reach the front of the room, Riker arrived. He pushed open the doors with a wide smile on his face, and a massive joint hanging from his mouth half-smoked. His men cheered as he entered, and Dantes moved to clasp his massive hand by way of greeting. Riker, welcome to the party. I was starting to worry you weren't interested in free booze, women, and money. It was making me second-guess working with you. Unauthorized reproduction. This story has been taken without approval. Reports sightings. Riker laughed. Sorry, I was trying to get blood to come, but he insisted on another raid. Booze, women, and money he likes for me to handle. A good fight is his only vice. Shame. I was hoping he might welcome me into the gang himself. Riker nodded. Oh, don't worry, he will. Part of the initiation is letting him beat you for a full minute. That's not something he'd miss. Though considering all you've done for us, he may limit it to a single. Dantes frowned, but gestured for him to follow him to the bar. They shared one, then another drink in comfortable silence, at novel been at. So, how did you manage to get them to go for the deal? Asked Riker. Dantes smiled widely. They've always liked me, so it wasn't too hard to get my foot in the door with them. I explained our meeting and laid out that things could either go the easy way or the hard way. The easy way meant protection, keeping at least a sliver of the profits, and me being the person they deal with directly. The hard way, well, I was going to leave the hard way up to you to figure out. Riker nodded with a smirk on his face. Leaving it up to the imagination, smart. Good whores have great imaginations, too. So they practically convinced themselves once they started to think of everything that could wind up happening to them. The line was delivered with an eerie coldness that surprised even Dantes himself. Riker took another long, slow drink and looked over to him. So, how does this work? You said would have to enter into some kind of fade deal with them? I'll be honest, it seems like an easy way for you to fuck me over. Dantes nodded. I understand, but it's the way they work. Without this deal made their way, they'll be able to fuck you over way worse than I could down the line. They'll explain it to you first, and then if you think it's not on the up and up, we can work something else out, but Dantes gestured around. I think it's pretty clear they're willing to work with us this way. Riker took a puff and placed his joint onto the bar, putting it out in a small puddle of spilled drink. All right, walk me through it. First, we'll assemble all of the changelings in the center of the room. Dantes smirked. We'll probably need to pull a few of your boys off of them first, of course. Riker chuckled and nodded. Then I'll lay out the deal. It's safest for me, since I know more about Fey law. Also, I want to make sure you keep your part of the bargain. Said Riker, clearly incredulous. Basically, you give me the authority to negotiate for you. I lay out the exact deal, and then you agree to what I say and what the changelings say. Still sounds like you'd be able to fuck me over here. Jacopo could feel Dante's anxiety. He knew Riker was savvy, but had hoped this would easier once head had plenty of smoke and drink. That's the thing. Dantes gestured for a changeling in the shape of a female dwarf with a luxuriously silky black beard. Any agreements Dantes makes in Riker's name can be voided by Riker at will. She nodded. Dantes looked at Riker. Get it? Now that I've spoken that you have the authority to void what you disagree with. Riker nodded. All right, that makes sense. So, do I have the authority to represent you? Riker finished his drink and nodded. Yes. Dantes smiled a too wide smile that seemed to stretch and contort his face until it reached from one ear to the other. What the foo, said Riker, his eyes widening in fear as he pushed himself away from the bar. his drink falling off of the bar with a crash. The bar got quiet as the orcs and changelings all shifted their attention to him. In the quiet, a door opened to a back room, and a second Dantes walked out, a less wide smile on his face. He moved over to his duplicate and patted him on the back. "Don't worry, Riker. As promised, any agreements I make in your name can be voided by you at will. Unfortunately, you just gave Sin the authority to represent you, not me." Riker's face contorted into a number of expressions: surprise, comprehension, then rage. He howled, grabbed the axe at his belt, and launched himself at the two of them. The other orcs began to move as well, only slightly slower than their leader. "Your name, and those men who give you their authorities' names, are mine," said Sin, quickly and calmly through the smile on her face. Riker stopped mid-leap, a look of sheer terror on his face as the whites of his eyes claimed their scara. Once that was complete, his expression became vacant. All of the other orcs in the brothel shared his blank expression. They were now under the control of the changelings, adding a third of the orcs' strength to their ranks of nameless. No one will be able to intimidate them again. Sin looked at Riker. "Take your men and slay the 2 guards you have outside." Riker didn't answer. He simply began moving toward the exit, a handful of the men that had foolishly said they trusted him with their lives trailing behind him. Dantes sent a wordless thanks to Jacopo for being his eyes and ears as he watched Sin impersonate him in the party. Jacopo responded with a request for fresh meat. Dantes looked over to Sin, who was still in his shape. "That was well done. You make a good me." She curtsied. "I've had a lot of practice observing you. The trick is to think I'm just a bit more charming and amusing than I actually am." Dantes frowned. "Sorry, did you say something? I was lost in my eyes." Dantes placed a small pouch of weed and a handful of blood-red grapes onto the raised stone in front of him that acted as a table. Wayne shook his head. "I'm out." Tell reached into his pocket and put a handful of copper coins down. "Coin, eh? Where'd you get that?" asked Dantes. "Did a favor for someone in the consortium," he said coyly. "What kind of favor?" asked Wayne with an eyebrow raised. "The kind that paid me in copper coins," responded Tell. Dantes chuckled. Tell was getting more attuned to the pit every day. At this rate, had become a well-known name, or dead. Those were basically the only 2 ways it could go. Pillion placed a small pouch of dust next to the other bets. It had clearly recently had a scoop taken out of it. It probably didn't amount to the same value as the other bets, but Dantes decided not to say anything, and Tell followed his lead. Pillion shook the dice, wincing as he did so. He was still having a bit of trouble from the beating head received. That was probably why the dust had so recently been used. Dantes took a moment to reflect on the fact that he may have set into motion a course of events that had turned someone to the same addiction that had tormented him when he himself had arrived in the pit 5 years prior, and smiled. Pillion shouldn't have been such an unrepentant asshole, and it wouldn't have happened. Pillion rolled the dice out and cursed the moment that they went still. Dantes muttered one under his own breath, too, as Tell smiled widely and pulled everything toward himself. "Fuck this. I want to be rolling the dice just to lose my shit all afternoon," said Pillion, collecting the dice and cup, and walking away muttering a colorful mix of elf, orc, and human slurs under his breath. Wayne sighed. "I may need to tell Merle about the dust he's been doing. A bit here, and there is no big deal, but when it makes someone like Pillion act like more of a dick," there was a touch of genuine concern in his voice as he spoke. Dantes ignored it. "You guys have any dice?" They shook their heads. "Guess we're done then." He moved to stand, then paused and looked at Wayne. "Unless you've got any news from the orcs." Wayne's expression hardened. "No." Dantes sighed. "I didn't know that you knew orcs at the party. At novel been at. Wayne held up a hand. "I know that. I also know that the changelings were defending themselves. And I know that if they'd continued the way things were going, then they probably would have come for the collar next." Dantes opened his mouth, but decided against saying anything. Some things needed time. Tell didn't have the same restraint, though. "Then why are you so mad?" Wayne's hands curled into fists. "Because they didn't even get to fight. Dantes and the changelings took their lives, but didn't do so in battle, and now they're dead on their feet and forced to serve their enemy. But you..." Wayne shot Tell a glare. "I know I criticized them before, and I'm aware I'm not being rational. That's why I'm still gambling at the table with him and still call him friend. That doesn't mean it has to be easy. If you come across this story on Amazon, be aware that it has been stolen from Royal Road. Please report it. Tell opened his mouth again, but Dantes put his hand up this time. It's fine, Tell. He nodded at Wayne. Good game. Maybe you'll get some dice from the undermarket tomorrow, so we don't have to rely on pillion. Wayne nodded. Sure, but I'll be checking to be sure they aren't weighted. Dante smiled. Of course. He gave Wayne and Tell a wave goodbye and started to make his way back to his cave. Wayne would have told him if he actually had any information on what the orcs had been up to since he and the changelings had taken a third of their forces, had been actively monitoring his tunnels with rats and spying on them. But from what had seen, they'd mostly been consolidating. They still had a larger force overall than the dwarves did after their massacre, and certainly more than the elves, so they were still a powerful gang in terms of numbers. But now that they'd made so many enemies so quickly, that arithmetic was starting to add up a bit differently. 2/3 strength with good relations was fine, but when everyone was now wary or outright hateful toward them, and a third they'd lost had gone to a group they just antagonized, that was different. Dantes reached out with his senses and detected a clump of moss next to him as he walked. He reached his hand out to it, and it shifted and moved as if trying to reach him. He focused and was able to make it form shapes and symbols as it reached out or flattened itself. But the more complex he made it, the more drained he began to feel. It wasn't like the rat or roach mark. It seemed to be based on his own physical stamina rather than any favor Head earned with plant life. Unless there was a tattoo of a tree on his ass that Head had yet to see. Still, it was getting easier with practice, and the garden he created reacted to his will with almost no effort at all, though it had begun causing him headaches of a different kind. Its hunger for blood had grown slowly at first, but now he heard it screaming at him when he first woke, until he went to sleep, all sense of politesse gone from its requests. Not that he expected much of that from plants, but it certainly seemed more relaxed about it in the past. Even at that moment, he could feel its hunger at the edge of his awareness. He sighed. You're being followed, said Jacopo as he walked. It took tremendous effort, but he didn't react to the statement and just kept walking. Who? How do you know? When your awareness fades from the rats you watch your back with, I take over. It's the elves, the two that work as bodyguards for Grimold. Dantes resisted nodding. That made sense. Grimold was making his move, trying to figure out where he was getting the fruit, maybe having him killed in the process. He was certain the elves had no qualms about the arrangement either. How far away are they? They're a few chambers behind, staying exactly that distance behind you. That was good. That meant that they were trying to determine the location of the fruit first, not kill him. That gave him more options, let him control where they went and when they attacked. He reached out his awareness and began gathering rats and roaches in as large of numbers as he could. Before long, there were hundreds of them moving in concert with him and his followers. Once they were in place, he switched with Jacopo to observe the elves more closely. I've never heard vermin be this active before, even in the deeper caves, said the older of the two elves. He moved in almost complete silence, gracefully gliding through the maze like caverns only a short way behind Dantes. Coming to fruits nearby. The younger one was squinting, as if reducing his sight would somehow let him hear Dante's footsteps better over the rising cacophony of scratching and chittering in the walls around them. It's possible, but that's not the strangest part. Do you smell that? The younger of them sniffed and gagged. I just smell roaches and rat shit. The older elf inhaled deeply. Greenery, I could swear. It's been so long, closest I've gotten was smelling that one dwarf's booth back in the undermarket. You're smelling dwarves now? I think you may just be losing it. It's possible, it's not like he's growing the fruit here. He almost certainly just found some way to have it transported down here. Some way of passing messages. Maybe he didn't destroy all of our mirrors. But what about? Dantes brought his attention back to himself. He didn't need to hear their speculation. He knew exactly how Head done it, after all. He started moving toward his cave, forming a plan. He could never win a straight-up fight. The elves were too skilled. It didn't take a trained fighter to see that. He could possibly drive them away with rats and roaches, or at least throw them off his trail, but that would just put off the problem rather than deal with. And the sooner the consortium realized he couldn't be fucked with, the sooner he could start negotiating with them for his escape. He also didn't like how close they'd gotten to him, twice now. If it hadn't been for Jacopo, he may have been taken completely unaware. He smiled as his plan solidified in his mind. If they wanted to find his source, he'd take them straight to it.